In the 12th century, the Mongolian steppe stretched endlessly across Asia, a landscape of sweeping grasslands, scattered rivers, and rugged mountains. Life here was not gentle. Winters froze the land solid, summers burned dry, and storms swept suddenly across the plains. Families survived by moving with their herds, chasing new pastures, and enduring constant hardship. It was in this world that a boy named Temujin was born, around the year 1162. His name would one day be replaced by a title known across the globe, but at his birth, he was simply another child of the steppe, dependent on his family, his horses, and his clan. The Borjigan clan, to which the boy belonged, was one of many tribes scattered across the vast plains. His father, Yasuge, carried some influence as a tribal leader, though his power was limited by the ceaseless rivalries of neighboring groups. His mother, Holun, had been taken by force in marriage, a practice not uncommon in these lands where strength and cunning often decided unions. The family's position was neither dominant nor weak. They held herds, weapons, and a place in the tangled politics of the steppe. For the boy himself, none of this mattered yet. His earliest years were shaped by the same lessons every child of the nomads had to learn. Children were expected to ride before they were old enough to speak clearly. Horses were the backbone of survival, carrying families to new grazing grounds, allowing warriors to raid neighbors, and providing milk and meat in lean times. From the saddle, the Borjigrain child learned balance, speed, and control, his knees guiding a pony across open grass. Alongside riding came archery. With bows fashioned from horn and sinew, the people of the steppe were unmatched in mounted warfare. Even children practiced daily, loosing arrows from horseback until they could hit moving targets at full gallop. These skills were not optional amusements. They were essential tools in a land where raids and ambushes could erupt at any moment. The boy's childhood seemed secure enough until disaster struck. When he was about 9 years old, his father arranged a marriage for him with a girl named Borte from another tribe. As custom dictated, the child went to live with her family, building bonds until the marriage could be completed. During this time, Yasuge accepted hospitality from enemies while traveling. They poisoned him at a feast, cutting his life short. His sudden death robbed the Borjigan household of its protector. With the leader gone, the family's allies abandoned them. Tribal loyalty was fragile, and without Yasuge's strength, his widow and children were cast out. The orphaned boy, his mother, and his siblings were forced to fend for themselves. Holun gathered berries, roots, and nuts to keep them alive, taught them to fish from rivers, and guided them across the plains in search of safety. Hunger was a constant companion. Cold winds battered their felt tents. Neighbors saw them not as allies, but as easy prey. For the young son of Yasuge, these years burned into memory. He learned the cruelty of betrayal and the necessity of resilience. Adolescence brought even harsher trials. Rival clans sought to eliminate potential threats. The Tayetchud captured the boy and enslaved him. A wooden collar was locked around his neck, marking him as a prisoner. Humiliation was part of the punishment. He was forced to labor under guard, his movements restricted, his pride tested daily. Yet even in this state, he remained observant. He watched for weaknesses, built quiet trust with one sympathetic guard, and waited for opportunity. When the chance came, he escaped. His return to freedom was not only a personal triumph, it showed an early ability to inspire loyalty beyond his own family. Reunited with his household, the youth began to rebuild. He honored the marriage arrangement and wed Borte, who became his lifelong partner. Their union strengthened his political ties and gave him a companion whose counsel would guide him through many hardships. Not long after the marriage, tragedy struck again when raiders from the Narration abducted Borte. For the young husband, this was a test of both courage and leadership. He gathered allies, among them a close companion named Jamuka, and launched a raid against the Narration. Together, they defeated the raiders and recovered Borte. The victory brought him more than his wife. It proved that he could organize warriors, strike decisively, and protect those under his care. Jamuka was more than an ally. The two had sworn a bond of blood brotherhood, a pledge of loyalty that steppe culture regarded as sacred. For a time, they dreamed of uniting the tribes, ending the cycle of vengeance and raids that plagued their world. Jamuka was charismatic and generous to nobles. The Borjigin chief, more reserved, emphasized fairness and discipline. Their partnership offered hope that a new order might emerge on the steppe. As his camp grew, the young leader continued to distinguish himself. He divided spoils fairly, ensuring that all who fought beside him received their share. He rewarded loyalty with trust and opportunity, allowing even men of humble birth to rise. He punished betrayal without hesitation, but he kept his promises to those who served faithfully. Families who joined him found that disputes were settled with consistency, not favoritism. Warriors who pledged themselves discovered that bravery and discipline mattered more than ancestry. The hardships of his youth had left their mark. He had known hunger, enslavement, and the loss of protection. Those experiences taught him that survival required fairness as well as force. The orphaned boy of the Borjigin clan was becoming a leader whose authority rested on more than tradition. In his camp, loyalty was earned, justice was enforced, and trust could outlast bloodline. Though few at the time could have predicted it, the young horseman who had once wandered the steppe in poverty was beginning a path that would one day place him at the head of the largest land empire the world had ever seen. On the vast plains of Mongolia, clans competed constantly for grazing land, herds, and honor. Alliances were made and broken with the seasons, and few chiefs trusted one another for long. In this unstable world, Temujin began to set himself apart, not by birthright, but by creating a new foundation of loyalty. Unlike rivals who depended on noble families, the young chief built his authority on fairness, discipline, and reward for service. The system he shaped broke with long-standing tradition. Most leaders placed their relatives at the top of every hierarchy, ensuring that noble kin received the best positions and greatest shares of plunder. This practice created resentment among warriors who lacked powerful family ties, men who often drifted between camps with little hope of advancement. The Borjigin leader offered something different. He watched carefully, promoted those who proved brave or reliable, and elevated men of talent, regardless of ancestry. Under his rule, a skilled herdsman or a loyal fighter could rise to command. This approach drew ambitious men from across the steppe, creating a following that was bound to him personally rather than to clan bloodlines. Marriage alliances strengthened this foundation. His union with Borta linked him to her family and added weight to his position. Other marriages within his household extended his web of connections. On the steppe, such arrangements were political as well as personal, knitting together clans through obligation and shared interest. Each bond reduced the number of potential enemies and expanded his reach beyond the narrow circle of the Borjigin. The most important bond of these years, however, was with Jamuka, a leader whose charisma attracted many followers. The two men swore, and the sacred oath of blood brotherhood. This pledge carried immense weight in Mongol culture, symbolizing complete loyalty, often valued above ties of family. For a time, The partnership flourished. Jamuka's charm and generosity appealed to noble clans, while the Borjigin chief's discipline and fairness won over warriors eager for opportunity. Together, they dreamed of ending the endless cycle of raids and forging a single authority over the tribes. But alliances on the steppe rarely endured without strain. As their followings grew, differences sharpened. Jamuka favored nobles, rewarding them with command and wealth because of their ancestry. The rising commander continued to elevate men by merit. This divergence cut to the heart of how power was distributed. Nobles, seeking to preserve their privileges, rallied to Jamuka. Ambitious warriors, who wanted a fair chance, gravitated toward the Borjigin camp. Slowly, the clans of Mongolia found themselves choosing between two competing visions of leadership, the old aristocracy and the new meritocracy. Conflict became inevitable. Jamuka gathered a host of 30,000, supported by noble families and their retainers. His rival could muster around 20,000, fewer in number, but better organized. The Borjigin army had been reshaped into structured units of tens, hundreds, and thousands. These groups trained to fight together, to retreat in order, and to strike with precision. They were not merely a gathering of clans, but a disciplined force, commanded by men who had earned their positions through loyalty and ability. When the two armies clashed on the plains, the difference in organization became clear. The smaller force fought with discipline, launching volleys of arrows from horseback, executing feigned retreats, and reforming quickly to counterattack. For a time, they held their ground against the larger host, but numbers eventually overwhelmed them. Jamuka's warriors pressed forward, and the Borjigin lines broke. Many were captured, and the battle ended in defeat for the young chief. Jamuka's victory, however, soon turned hollow, determined to crush his rival completely. He ordered 70 captured warriors executed by boiling, a punishment so brutal it shocked even hardened steppe fighters. Violence was common in this world, but such cruelty was regarded as dishonorable and excessive. The story spread quickly, carried by survivors and witnesses. Men who had admired Jamuka began to question his judgment. Some deserted him, unwilling to serve under a leader whose actions stained his honor. In contrast, the reputation of the defeated chief grew. Though he had lost the battle, he was remembered as disciplined, fair, and restrained. He had not resorted to dishonor or cruelty, even in hardship. In the eyes of many, Jamuka's triumph looked shameful, while the Borjigin leader's loss looked noble. In the aftermath, the orphaned son gathered his remaining loyalists and began to rebuild. He promised fairness in the division of spoils, reaffirmed his commitment to rewarding service over birth, and drilled his men in new maneuvers. Slowly, warriors disillusioned with Jamuka drifted to his side. Families who had once hesitated began to see safety in his camp. The discipline he demanded created a sense of order, rare on the steppe, and the fairness he practiced encouraged loyalty that endured beyond the fortunes of a single battle. This resilience became one of his defining qualities. Defeat did not end his rise. Instead, it clarified the differences between himself and his rival. Jamuka represented tradition, nobles favored, cruelty accepted, and loyalty bought by wealth alone. The Borjigin commander represented something new, loyalty based on trust, rewards tied to merit, and justice delivered with consistency. The contrast was stark, and more men chose the latter path. The rivalry between the two leaders was far from finished. One commanded larger numbers and the weight of tradition. The other had discipline, fairness, and the loyalty of men who believed in a new way of organizing life on the steppe. Though the balance had not yet tipped decisively, The foundations of a future shift were already being laid. The defeat at the hands of Jamuka might have crushed another man's ambitions. For Temujin, it became the moment to impose a deeper sense of discipline on his camp. Where other chiefs relied on shifting loyalty and the weight of custom, the Borjigin leader began shaping rules that bound his people more firmly than bloodline or tradition ever could. The nomadic tribes of Mongolia had long lived by flexible customs, adjusting practices from season to season, from camp to camp. Chiefs mediated disputes according to personal preference, and warriors served so long as their families were satisfied with the rewards. The young chief recognized that such fluid arrangements would never create stability. If he hoped to hold a growing force together, he needed clear laws, consistent discipline, and a structure that outlasted temporary agreements. The result was the beginnings of a code remembered as the Yasa. This body of law was not set down in writing, but it was spoken, memorized, and enforced with exactness. Rules forbade the theft of animals from allies, mandated fair division of spoils, and outlawed false oaths. Feuds that had once stretched on for generations were to be replaced by impartial judgment. In war, cowardice and betrayal were punished with severity, while loyalty and bravery were rewarded openly. Such measures gave his camp a sense of stability, rare on the steppe, where many still lived in fear of sudden betrayal or arbitrary punishment. To make these laws effective, the Borjigin leader reorganized his followers into a system of tens, hundreds, and thousands. This decimal structure was revolutionary in its simplicity. Every warrior belonged to a group of 10, responsible for one another's conduct. 10 groups formed 100, 10 hundreds formed 1,000, and 10 thousands made up the largest division, the Tumen. Commanders were selected not for noble birth, but for reliability and skill. In this way, the old web of clan loyalties was weakened. Warriors were no longer tied to their relatives alone. They were tied to the unit, and through it, to the chief himself. This organization gave the rising commander a powerful advantage in battle. Where other tribes fought as clusters of kin, often scattering under pressure, his men moved as one. They could retreat without breaking apart, feign flight to lure an enemy, or wheel suddenly to encircle a larger host. Orders traveled quickly down the chain of command, and men trusted that those beside them would hold their place. In combat, this discipline turned a smaller force into a formidable opponent. In daily life, it created order in camp, reducing quarrels and strengthening bonds between men who once might have been strangers. The young chief also established a personal guard known as the Keshig. This body of hand-picked warriors lived near him, protected him, and served as his most trusted core. The service in the guard was not restricted to nobles. Any man who demonstrated loyalty and courage could be selected, making membership a mark of honor. The guard rotated duties to ensure constant vigilance and acted as an example of discipline for the rest of the army. In time, many of the guard would rise to command larger units, spreading their values throughout the force. Families who joined the Borjigin camp found themselves living under rules that promoted fairness. Disputes were settled by consistent judgment rather than favoritism. Spoils were divided openly, and even those of humble standing received their share. Women and children were protected under the new order, and the bonds of marriage alliances were honored. Merchants who passed through carried stories of a camp where order prevailed, a place safer than many others on the unpredictable steppe. Word of such practices spread, and each new story drew more people into his orbit. The attraction of fairness was powerful. Many households joined willingly, drawn by the stability of life under his banner. Others came after defeat, surprised to find that surrender did not mean humiliation. Unlike rival chiefs who stripped captives of property and dignity, the Borjigin leader allowed families to retain honor and security if they pledged loyalty. This policy made resistance less appealing and encouraged clans to accept his authority without prolonged conflict. With each addition, his camp grew larger, his herds richer, and his influence wider. The creation of law and order also strengthened his authority in spiritual terms. The people of the steppe worshipped the eternal blue sky and revered the spirits of their ancestors. Victory in battle, survival against the odds, and the growth of his following were seen as signs of divine favor. Shamans, respected for their visions and rituals, sometimes spoke of destiny surrounding the Borjigin chief. By enforcing justice and discipline, he appeared not only as a capable leader, but as a man guided by higher powers. Such belief added weight to his commands, deepening the loyalty of his followers. Of course, opposition remained. Rival chiefs saw his reforms as threats to their own authority. They clung to the old aristocratic model, where nobles enjoyed privilege and common warriors had little voice. They whispered that discipline was a disguise for tyranny, that his rules were chains meant to bind men too tightly. Yet even as they criticized, their followers noticed the strength of his growing camp, the fairness of his rewards, and the order of his army. Many who heard such stories began to drift away from old leaders and toward the new one. When clashes broke out, the differences between the systems were stark. Traditional forces fought bravely, but scattered when pressured. The Borjigin army maneuvered as a single body, feigning retreats, striking flanks, and regrouping at will. Smaller victories accumulated, each reinforcing the impression that discipline and law were stronger than tradition and privilege. Each success encouraged more families to join, swelling his strength and widening his influence. The young chief's resilience became a pattern. Setbacks no longer threatened to scatter his following, for the laws held them together. Victories drew in new warriors, but even defeats failed to break the loyalty of those bound by fairness and order. By building a system larger than himself, he ensured that his authority did not rest solely on charisma or fortune. It rested on rules, organization, and trust, elements that could endure. By the end of this period, the Borjigin leader commanded not only an army, but the beginnings of a new political structure. Families saw him as a protector who enforced fairness. Warriors saw him as a commander who rewarded merit. Allies saw him as a force who could not be ignored. The dream of uniting the Mongol tribes, once unimaginable, was now closer than ever, built on the foundation of discipline, justice, and law. The rivalry between Jamuka and the Borjigin leader did not end with one battle. For a time, Jamuka's victory gave him the appearance of supremacy, his larger following intimidating smaller clans. Yet the seeds of his decline had already been planted. The boiling of captives after the battle stained his reputation in a way that could not be erased. On the steppe, cruelty was tolerated, but dishonor was not. Families whispered of his excess. Warriors grew uneasy, and slowly the balance began to shift. The young chief, who had endured defeat, refused to vanish into obscurity, while Jamuka basked in the glow of short-lived triumph. The Borjigin camp rebuilt with quiet determination. Families disillusioned by cruelty trickled into his ranks, bringing herds and warriors with them. Each household was welcomed under clear rules and protected by a sense of fairness. Over time, this trickle became a steady stream. The reputation of the rising commander spread wider than Jamuka's boasts. Discipline remained the key. Units drilled constantly, perfecting the feigned retreat, the encircling maneuver, and the swift redeployment of cavalry. Scouts rode far ahead, mapping terrain, noting the strength of rivals, and preparing the field before battle ever began. The army became more than a gathering of warriors. It became a machine guided by precision. Merchants passing through camps described soldiers who obeyed signals instantly, who shared spoils fairly, and who fought with a unity uncommon among nomads. Such reports only enhanced the aura of the Borjigin leader. Meanwhile, Jamuka's reliance on noble support proved unstable. Nobles valued wealth and privilege, but they also valued survival. As his cruelty alienated common warriors, his own base weakened. Raids against him found less resistance, and his followers began to question whether his leadership truly served their interests. Families that once swore loyalty to Jamuka now watched carefully for opportunities to defect. When conflicts resumed, the difference between the two leaders' systems became stark once more. The Borjigin army, smaller in number, but drilled in discipline, could scatter and regroup at will, harassing larger forces until exhaustion set in. Jamuka's host often outnumbered them, but lacked cohesion. Once his forces broke, they could not easily be reformed. The Borjigin leader seized every advantage, ensuring that even minor victories carried symbolic weight. The young chief also understood the importance of mercy as a weapon. Where Jamuka had resorted to boiling captives, the Borjigin camp offered fair treatment to those who surrendered. Families spared from humiliation remembered their deliverance and spoke of the justice of the Borjigin leader. Word of such acts spread rapidly across the plains, and each retelling contrasted his fairness with Jamuka's cruelty. Reputation became as powerful as swords, winning new allies without bloodshed. The decline of Jamuka accelerated as clans peeled away. Some left quietly, slipping out in the night to join the new order. Others openly shifted allegiance, tired of the instability that followed their chief's brutality. Each loss weakened Jamuka's standing and emboldened his rival. Soon the balance that once favored him tilted toward the Borjigin camp. To secure this advantage, the rising commander forged alliances with tribes previously neutral or hostile. He promised stability and fairness, offering a future in which disputes would be resolved through law rather than endless raids. Many accepted, weary of the cycle of vengeance that had consumed their lives. By the time Jamuka recognized the erosion of his base, it was too late to reverse the tide. One confrontation after another reduced Jamuka's following. Defeats scattered his warriors, while his rival's camp grew stronger with each success. Eventually, Jamuka was forced to flee, abandoning the dream of uniting the tribes under his authority. He would return in later years, but his aura of inevitability was broken forever. The steppe now looked increasingly to the Borjigin leader as the figure capable of bringing unity. The fall of Jamuka's dominance marked a turning point. The aristocratic model he embodied, favoring noble birth, indulging cruelty, and relying on intimidation, proved incapable of holding power in the face of a new system based on merit, fairness, and discipline. The young commander had demonstrated that order could outlast numbers, and justice could attract more loyalty than fear. His rivals saw the lesson clearly, even if they would not admit it. By the end of this struggle, the Borjigin camp was larger than ever. Families rested more securely under his protection. Warriors trained with greater purpose, and the laws that bound them held strong. The orphaned boy who had once lived on scraps was now the leader of a force that shaped the politics of the steppe. Though many challenges remained, the collapse of Jamuka's supremacy left him in a position of growing strength, poised to take the next steps toward uniting the Mongol tribes under one rule. With Jamuka in retreat and his reputation stained by cruelty, the Borjigin leader held a stronger position than ever before. Yet survival on the steppe demanded constant vigilance. Power was never secure, and rivals waited for any sign of weakness. The young chief understood that to maintain momentum, he needed to continue broadening his alliances, strengthening discipline, and binding his followers more tightly to his vision of order. The system of tens, hundreds, and thousands had already transformed his army into a disciplined force. But it was not only warriors who required structure. Families, herders, and artisans who lived under his authority also needed clarity in daily life. Rules governed disputes over pasture, trade, and inheritance. Strangers who joined his camp were quickly integrated into existing households or units, ensuring they had a place and a duty. In this way, the camp grew without falling into chaos, a rare achievement in a society where sudden growth often led to instability. As the number of households swelled, so did the demand for resources. Herds were expanded, grazing lands were claimed, and raiding parties secured additional animals from rivals. Yet even in these raids, discipline distinguished the Borjigin followers from others. Spoils were divided fairly, preventing quarrels that could fracture unity. Leaders who failed in their duties were held accountable, a practice uncommon among chiefs who usually protected their relatives at all costs. Over time, this reputation for fairness created an expectation among his people. Loyalty would be rewarded, and betrayal punished, regardless of birth. To secure lasting bonds, the young commander relied on more than discipline alone. He cultivated personal loyalty through the distribution of titles and honors. Men who proved themselves were entrusted with greater responsibilities, leading units, commanding raids, or negotiating with allies. These positions were not ceremonial. They carried real authority and the expectation of continued service. By granting such roles, he ensured that capable men felt invested in his leadership. Their fortunes rose with his, binding them tightly to his cause. The Keshig, his personal guard, played a central role in this expanding system. Members of the guard were not only protectors, but also symbols of the new order. Their presence at councils and in battle reminded others that loyalty and merit led directly to the chief's side. Service in the guard became a coveted prize, encouraging warriors to display bravery and obedience in hopes of being chosen. This elite unit provided stability at the center of his authority, a constant reminder of the values that distinguished his camp. All the while, the Borgian chief balanced diplomacy with force. Some clans were brought into his orbit through marriage alliances or negotiated agreements. Others resisted and were confronted in battle. In each case, he emphasized predictability. Surrender brought safety, while resistance risked destruction. This approach reduced the number of prolonged conflicts and encouraged families to submit without bloodshed. The cycle of conquest and integration steadily expanded his influence. Stories of fairness and order continued to spread. Merchants traveling the steppe carried tales of a leader who punished theft, honored promises, and shared spoils evenly. Families who lived under his protection reported fewer disputes and more stability. In a land where betrayal was common, these stories carried weight. Reputation became a weapon as powerful as cavalry, drawing new supporters without the need for force. Rival chiefs still plotted against him, fearing the erosion of their own authority. They whispered warnings that his rules were chains, that his fairness masked ambition, and that his growing power threatened their independence. Yet their words often failed to convince. Warriors compared the discipline and rewards of the Borjigin camp with the disorder and favoritism of the old order. Families weighed the safety offered by his laws against the uncertainty of their former lives. More often than not, the comparison favored the rising commander. As his influence spread, the young chief began to envision more than survival or even dominance over a few neighboring tribes. He dreamed of uniting all the Mongol clans under one authority, ending the endless cycle of vengeance and creating a structure that could endure. Such a goal required not only strength, but legitimacy, for chiefs across the steppe would not yield easily. To prepare for this larger ambition, he tightened his internal system, ensuring that his army and camp could withstand both conflict and growth. The shift was visible in every part of his following. Warriors trained more rigorously, families lived under clearer rules, and commanders enforced discipline without hesitation. What had begun as a small household, abandoned after Yasuge's death, had now grown into a powerful force, shaping the politics of the steppe. The orphaned son of the Borjigin clan had turned hardship into strength, and his momentum showed no sign of slowing. The groundwork was laid for a confrontation far larger than personal rivalries. The young chief's rise had already overturned the balance of power once. Soon, it would challenge the very structure of steppe society as the dream of unity moved closer to reality. As the Borjigin leader's influence grew, opposition hardened among tribes, unwilling to accept his vision of unity. Chiefs who clung to traditional privileges recognized the threat he posed. If his system spread, their reliance on noble birth would mean little, and their authority would weaken. These leaders gathered together, forming alliances aimed at halting the rise of the young commander before it consumed the steppe. The conflicts that followed were not single battles, but a series of skirmishes, raids, and confrontations spread across seasons. Each tribe brought its own strengths, but few matched the discipline of the Borjigin army. Units drilled to act as one body, responding to signals with precision. Scouts moved far ahead, charting terrain and counting enemy herds. When rivals advanced, the disciplined cavalry harassed them with arrows, then withdrew in perfect order, only to strike again when the enemy faltered. This method of war wore down opponents. Traditional forces often charged boldly, but broke apart when faced with coordinated maneuvers. The Borjigin cavalry turned speed and discipline into weapons, delivering blows at times and places of their choosing. Even when outnumbered, the young chief's forces inflicted damage and withdrew before the enemy could recover. Over time, these tactics weakened resistance and sapped the confidence of rivals who once believed sheer numbers were enough to guarantee victory. Each confrontation also reinforced the reputation of fairness. Captured families were spared humiliation. If they submitted, their property and dignity preserved under new authority. Warriors who switched sides found themselves treated with respect, given places in the structured units of tens and hundreds. This approach encouraged defections, turning enemies into followers and swelling the ranks without prolonged bloodshed. The promise of safety and opportunity became a powerful incentive, reducing the will of rivals to resist. Marriage alliances further expanded the circle of loyalty. Daughters of noble families were married into the Borjigin household, binding old rivals into the new order. These unions carried deep political significance. A clan that once fought fiercely against the rising commander might soften once a daughter or sister lived in his camp. Through such bonds, resistance was transformed into cooperation, at least for a time. The growing power of the Borjigin chief did not go unnoticed beyond Mongolia. Traders carried stories of a leader who rewarded loyalty, enforced laws, and punished betrayal consistently. News of his discipline spread across caravan routes, reaching lands far to the west and south. For now, these tales were only whispers, but they foreshadowed a time when his name would be recognized far beyond the steppe. Despite growing strength, danger remained constant. Rivals attempted ambushes, set traps along migration routes, and raided herds to undermine his authority. Yet the organization of his followers made these attacks less damaging. Scouts warned of threats, units responded quickly, and discipline ensured that even surprise strikes could be contained. Each failed ambush added to his reputation as a leader favored by fortune and protected by the eternal blue sky. The personal guard, the keshig, became increasingly central during this period. More than protectors, they were enforcers of the new order. Their presence at councils and on campaigns reminded followers that loyalty was valued above all else. The guard embodied the principles of merit and discipline, setting an example for the entire camp. Warriors who aspired to join them trained harder, fought braver, and followed orders more faithfully, reinforcing the cohesion of the army. The expansion of authority also brought logistical challenges. Larger herds required more pasture, greater numbers of people demanded more food, and the constant movement of camp had to be carefully planned. The young commander responded with stricter organization. Roles were assigned for managing supplies, ensuring herds were rotated efficiently, and overseeing the storage of provisions. By treating these tasks with the same seriousness as warfare, he kept his growing camp stable. Disorder was the weakness of many tribes, but under his leadership, order became the foundation of survival. With each passing season, his authority stretched wider. Tribes that had once mocked his rise now hesitated to oppose him directly. Some joined willingly, others after defeat, but the result was the same. The new order grew, and the old ways receded. Step by step, the dream of unity was moving closer. The boy who had once lived as an outcast was now a chief, whose authority commanded respect across the plains. The Borjigin leader had survived betrayal, rebuilt after defeat, and drawn strength from both discipline and fairness. By now his influence extended across much of the Mongolian steppe. Tribes that once stood as enemies had either joined his banner or been subdued, and families who once feared betrayal now found stability under his laws. Yet one step remained before he could claim a position unmatched by any other chief: recognition as the supreme ruler of the Mongols. The path to this moment required more than victories in battle. It demanded legitimacy that could be accepted by rival clans, even those who had long resisted. Steppe society valued consensus at great councils known as kurultai. At these gatherings, leaders and elders debated, feasted, and chose khans. To be acknowledged at such a council was to be elevated above all others. Without it, a leader's claim remained incomplete. The Borjigin commander understood that he could not simply seize authority by force. He had to secure it through tradition as well. In preparation, he strengthened the symbols of his leadership. The laws he enforced were expanded and repeated at councils, binding his growing confederation under a shared code. His personal guard stood as a visible reminder that loyalty to him brought honor and safety. His discipline in dividing spoils and rewarding service gave warriors confidence that following him would lead to prosperity. These measures not only kept his own followers loyal, but also made his rule attractive to families still hesitant to join. Religious legitimacy also played a role. The people of the steppe revered the eternal blue sky, believing it guided the fates of men and nations. Shamans, respected for their visions, often spoke of signs in the natural world that revealed destiny. The Borjigin chief's survival through hardship, his string of victories, and the steady growth of his camp were interpreted by many as proof that he enjoyed the favor of heaven. By aligning his cause with divine approval, he positioned himself as more than a successful warlord. He became a figure chosen by higher powers to rule. When the time came, a great council was called. Chiefs, elders, and representatives from across the steppe gathered to decide who would hold the title of Khan. Such councils were marked by rituals, offerings, and solemn vows. At this gathering, the Borjigin leader's reputation spoke louder than any speech. He had shown fairness in judgment, discipline in command, and mercy toward those who surrendered. He had punished betrayal, but rewarded loyalty regardless of ancestry. In a land weary of endless feuds, these qualities mattered more than noble birth. The council declared him Khan, the supreme leader of the Mongols. With this title came recognition that his authority extended beyond his own clan, beyond his immediate allies, to encompass all who submitted to him. His name would still carry the memory of his birth, but from this moment forward, he would be remembered above all as Genghis Khan. The title itself carried immense weight, symbolizing not only leadership but destiny. The ceremony was not only symbolic but practical. Families pledged loyalty, warriors swore oaths, and leaders acknowledged his supremacy. Banners were raised, gifts exchanged, and vows taken in the name of the eternal blue sky. The gathering cemented what battles and alliances had already made clear. The young chief, who had once been abandoned as an orphan, now stood as the master of the Mongol tribes. Recognition as Khan did not mean that opposition vanished. Rivalries still simmered, and some tribes resisted his authority even after the council. Yet the momentum was now firmly in his favor. With the title of Genghis Khan, his rule carried legitimacy that no rival could easily challenge. Families who hesitated now found themselves compelled to submit, while allies took pride in being part of a confederation with divine and traditional sanction. The unification of the Mongol tribes was a monumental achievement. For centuries, the steppe had been fractured by endless feuds, with no single leader able to impose lasting order. Genghis Khan broke that pattern. Through discipline, fairness, and the careful blending of tradition with innovation, he forged a unity that no one before him had accomplished. The steppe, once a patchwork of warring clans, now stood under a single authority, prepared to look beyond its borders. The elevation to supreme leadership marked the beginning of a new chapter. The tribes were no longer scattered rivals, but a united people, under one Khan. With unity achieved, attention could turn outward, toward the powerful neighbors that surrounded the steppe. The foundations had been laid for conquests that would stretch far beyond Mongolia, reshaping the history of Asia and the world. With the tribes united under his authority, Genghis Khan no longer fought simply for survival or for dominance over neighbors. The unification of Mongolia gave him something no chief before him had possessed: a disciplined nation of warriors bound by law, order, and loyalty. This new strength could not remain confined within the borders of the steppe. Herds required new pastures, warriors demanded opportunities for plunder and glory, and the ambitions of their leader extended far beyond the familiar plains. The first major target outside Mongolia was the Tangut Kingdom of Western Sha. Located to the south, this sedentary state controlled fertile lands, fortified cities, and trade routes that connected China with Central Asia. To nomadic tribes accustomed to the hardships of the grasslands, the wealth of Western Sha seemed immense. Its markets offered silk, grain, and manufactured goods, treasures rare on the steppe. At the same time, the Tangut rulers were wary of their northern neighbors, building defenses and maintaining armies to deter raids. For Genghis Khan, Western Sha was both a threat and an opportunity. Confronting the kingdom would test the strength of his newly unified army, while success would provide resources to sustain his growing confederation. The campaign began with swift cavalry raids, striking border settlements and seizing supplies. The disciplined units of tens, hundreds, and thousands moved with speed, outmaneuvering defenders unused to facing such coordinated assaults. The Tangut forces, though well-equipped, were less mobile. Their strength lay in fortified cities and heavy infantry, not in open-field maneuver. Genghis Khan exploited this difference. His cavalry avoided direct clashes with large enemy formations, focusing instead on disrupting supply lines, cutting communications, and harassing isolated garrisons. Over time, these tactics wore down resistance, forcing the Tangut rulers to negotiate. One of the key lessons of this campaign was the importance of siege warfare. Steppe armies excelled in mobility and archery, but struggled against walled cities. Genghis Khan addressed this weakness by incorporating foreign specialists into his ranks. Engineers captured from neighboring states were compelled to serve, building siege engines, catapults, and towers. Their knowledge allowed the Mongols to breach fortifications that once seemed impenetrable. With each victory, the army learned new techniques, blending steppe mobility with the methods of sedentary warfare. The campaign against Western Shah also reinforced the principle of psychological warfare. The Mongols spread fear by striking suddenly, sparing those who surrendered, but punishing resistance harshly. Towns that opened their gates were treated with leniency, allowed to keep property and lives. Those that resisted were destroyed as examples. Over time, word of this policy spread. Cities began to yield at the mere sight of Mongol banners, choosing surrender over devastation. By forcing Western Shah into submission, Genghis Khan secured tribute, trade, and recognition of his authority. The victory demonstrated that his power extended beyond the steppe, and that even established kingdoms could not ignore him. For his warriors, the campaign provided wealth and confidence. They returned to Mongolia with spoils, stories of conquest, and renewed loyalty to their leader, who had delivered both victory and prosperity. This first success encouraged further ambition. If Western Shah could be subdued, why not greater powers? To the east lay the Jin dynasty, rulers of northern China, wealthy and powerful, but also burdened with internal divisions. To the west lay the vast lands of Central Asia, dotted with cities along the Silk Road, rich in commerce and culture. The horizon of possibility expanded, and with it, the determination of Genghis Khan to test the limits of his strength. The campaigns beyond Mongolia also began to shape the identity of the Mongol nation. Once fractured clans, fighting for survival, they now marched together as a disciplined force, conquering kingdoms. Their laws, structure, and loyalty set them apart from both their nomadic rivals and their sedentary enemies. Unity gave them resilience, discipline gave them strength, and the leadership of Genghis Khan gave them direction. The conquest of Western Shah was only the beginning. It proved that the Mongols could face fortified states and emerge victorious. It taught them the value of siegecraft, engineering, and psychological strategy. Most of all, it convinced them that their destiny lay not in isolation, but in expansion. The steppe was no longer enough. The world beyond beckoned, and the Mongol armies were ready to answer. To the east of Mongolia lay one of the wealthiest and most formidable powers of the age, the Jin dynasty. This empire, ruled by the Jurchen people, controlled vast territories of northern China. Its cities were walled and fortified, its armies large and well-supplied, and its wealth unmatched on the steppe. For generations, the Jin had collected tribute from nomadic tribes, demanding submission in exchange for trade and peace. To many Mongols, the Jin were seen as both a source of coveted goods and as an oppressive overlord. For Genghis Khan, they represented the greatest challenge yet to his authority and ambition. The decision to confront the Jin was not taken lightly. The dynasty commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers, fortified cities that stretched across the northern plains, and an economy far stronger than anything the Mongols had encountered. Yet Genghis Khan believed that discipline, mobility, and unity could overcome even such power. He prepared his forces carefully, gathering intelligence through scouts and spies, forging alliances with tribes on the Jin frontier, and ensuring that his army was supplied for a long campaign. The Mongols began with raids designed to probe defenses and test responses. Cavalry swept into borderlands, striking quickly, seizing supplies, and retreating before large Jin forces could assemble. These attacks revealed weaknesses in the enemy's coordination. Though the Jin had vast resources, their armies were often slow to mobilize, burdened by heavy infantry and the bureaucracy of a large state. The Mongols exploited this, striking where resistance was weak and vanishing before reinforcements arrived. When full-scale war began, Genghis Khan unleashed the full discipline of his army. Units of tens, hundreds, and thousands moved with precision, attacking from multiple directions, encircling enemies, and striking supply lines. Jin armies found themselves harassed constantly, forced to defend long borders while never knowing where the next attack would fall. The psychological strain of facing such elusive enemies began to erode morale. The campaign also highlighted the growing importance of siege warfare. Many Jin cities were fortified with high walls, towers, and gates designed to resist cavalry. The Mongols, once inexperienced in such methods, now employed captured engineers to build siege engines. Catapults hurled stones, towers allowed assaults on walls, and sappers dug beneath defenses. The combination of mobility in the field and engineering at sieges created a formidable threat. City after city fell, often after prolonged resistance, but always leaving survivors with the memory of Mongol determination. One of the most significant victories came with the capture of Zhongdu, the Jin capital, located near present-day Beijing. The siege lasted for months, testing both sides to their limits. The defenders relied on massive walls, supplies stored in advance, and the determination of a wealthy capital. The attackers relied on persistence, siegecraft, and the constant pressure of cavalry raids around the region to isolate the city. Eventually, Zhongdu fell. The loss of their capital stunned the Jin dynasty, sending shockwaves across northern China and beyond. The fall of Zhongdu demonstrated not only the power of Mongol arms, but also the ruthlessness of their strategy. Cities that resisted were punished severely, their destruction serving as a warning to others. Those that surrendered early were treated with relative leniency, spared devastation if they accepted Mongol authority. Over time, this policy created a pattern. Resistance led to annihilation. Submission led to survival. The lesson spread quickly, shaping the decisions of many communities facing Mongol advance. The campaign against the Jin also provided immense wealth. The capture of cities brought grain, textiles, weapons, and precious metals into Mongol hands. Tribute flowed from conquered territories, supporting further campaigns and rewarding loyal warriors. For the nomadic followers of Genghis Khan, accustomed to the scarcity of the steppe, the riches of China seemed extraordinary. This wealth reinforced loyalty, ensuring that his warriors saw conquest as both profitable and honorable. Beyond material gains, the war against the Jin transformed the Mongols into a power recognized across Asia. No longer were they seen as scattered raiders or tribal confederations. They had defeated one of the great dynasties of the world, capturing its capital and humbling its rulers. Their reputation for invincibility grew, spreading fear and respect along the Silk Road and into neighboring kingdoms. For Genghis Khan himself, the victory confirmed his vision of unity and discipline. What had once been a dream of binding clans together had now become a force capable of toppling empires. The orphaned boy, who had once scavenged for food, had become the master of armies that could reshape nations. His name now carried weight, not only among the Mongols, but across the civilized world. The Jin were not destroyed entirely. The dynasty survived in the south for a time, but their hold over the north was broken. The Mongols had proven they could face and defeat the most powerful neighbors at their border. The steppe had given birth to a force that even ancient dynasties could not contain. The conquest of the Jin marked a turning point. From this moment forward, Genghis Khan was no longer merely a tribal ruler or even a regional conqueror. He was a world figure, his armies moving beyond Mongolia and into the heartlands of Asia. The momentum of conquest would not stop with the Jin. Ahead lay new campaigns across deserts, mountains, and cities, stretching toward lands that had never imagined the arrival of horsemen from the steppe. The conquest of northern China had proven that Genghis Khan and his warriors could overcome a great dynasty. Yet his ambitions stretched even further. To the west lay Central Asia, a region of deserts, mountains, and fertile valleys, threaded by the roots of the Silk Road. Cities here thrived on trade, connecting China with Persia, India, and lands far beyond. Caravans carried silk, spices, gems, and knowledge across these roads, making the region a crossroads of civilizations. For the Mongols, Central Asia represented both opportunity and danger. To leave it unconquered was to leave a rival unchecked at their frontier. One of the most powerful states in this region was the Khwarezmian Empire, centered in Persia but stretching deep into Central Asia. It controlled wealthy cities such as Samarkand, Bukhara, and Urgench. The empire was ruled by Shah Ala-Din Muhammad, a monarch ambitious in his own right. At first, Genghis Khan sought peaceful relations. He sent caravans laden with goods to establish trade, hoping to exchange Mongolian livestock and furs for textiles, grain, and luxury items. Trade would enrich both sides, and peace would secure the Mongols' western frontier. But peace was not to last. The Shah, suspicious of Mongol intentions, allowed one of the caravans to be seized. Merchants were killed, and goods were stolen. When Genghis Khan demanded justice, he received insults instead of apologies. The Shah executed Mongol envoys, a violation of the sacred custom of safe passage. Such an act was more than an insult. It was a declaration of defiance. The response was swift and decisive. The Mongol leader resolved to punish the Khwarezmian Empire for its betrayal. He assembled his armies, drawing warriors from every corner of his growing empire. The campaign into Central Asia would become one of the most remarkable military operations in history, demonstrating not only Mongol ferocity, but also their mastery of strategy, logistics, and psychological warfare. The march westward was daunting. The armies crossed vast stretches of desert, where water was scarce and survival uncertain. Yet discipline carried them forward. Scouts rode ahead to locate wells, engineers devised methods to store supplies, and strict organization ensured that herds and provisions moved efficiently. Where other forces might have faltered in such conditions, the Mongols pressed onward with relentless determination. When they reached the rich cities of Central Asia, the difference between nomadic cavalry and sedentary defenders became clear. The Mongols surrounded cities, cutting them off from supplies, then launched sieges with catapults, siege towers, and rams built by captured engineers. At Bukhara, they stormed the walls after a fierce assault. The city, famed for its scholars and merchants, was subdued and brought under Mongol control. Samarkand, one of the jewels of the Silk Road, soon followed. Its defenders included war elephants and well-armed soldiers, but they could not match the speed and coordination of the Mongol cavalry. The city fell after intense fighting. Genghis Khan reportedly addressed the survivors, declaring that his rise had been decreed by the eternal blue sky and that resistance had brought them to ruin. Such proclamations reinforced the sense of inevitability surrounding his conquests, blending spiritual authority with military might. Urgench proved the most difficult. Its walls were strong, its population large, and its defenders determined. The siege dragged on, testing the endurance of both sides. When the city finally fell, destruction followed on a massive scale. The devastation was intended as a warning to others. Resistance would bring annihilation. Surrender would bring survival. This dual policy spread fear across the region, encouraging some cities to yield without a fight. The Shah himself fled before the advancing Mongols, pursued across his empire until he died in obscurity on an island in the Caspian Sea. His once mighty state collapsed under the weight of Mongol attacks, its cities captured, its trade routes seized, and its authority shattered. The empire that had insulted envoys and defied negotiation was no more. The campaign into Central Asia was more than punishment. It secured Mongol control over key sections of the Silk Road, bringing immense wealth and resources into their hands. Caravans now moved under Mongol protection, their tolls and taxes enriching the empire. Knowledge flowed as well, for the conquest brought artisans, scholars, and engineers into Mongol service. Skills in architecture, mathematics, and administration were absorbed into the growing empire, broadening its capabilities beyond warfare. The impact on the region was profound. Entire cities were depopulated or destroyed, trade networks were disrupted, and political structures collapsed. At the same time, the Mongols imposed order where chaos had reigned. Caravans traveled more safely under their protection than they had for centuries. Merchants who once feared raids now moved with relative security across Mongol-controlled lands. The paradox of destruction and stability became a hallmark of Genghis Khan's rule. For the Mongols themselves, the conquest of Central Asia was proof that no power was beyond their reach. They had humbled kingdoms in China, subdued tribes across the steppe, and now toppled one of the great empires of the Islamic world. Their confidence soared, their reputation spread, and their leaders' vision of world conquest no longer seemed a distant dream. The road into Central Asia opened new horizons. To the west lay Persia and the Middle East. To the south lay India. To the east, China still beckoned with vast wealth. The Mongol horsemen, hardened by steppe survival and bound by discipline, now stood at the crossroads of civilizations. Their leader, once an orphan abandoned on the plains, had become the master of cities that had flourished for centuries. The march of conquest was far from over. The fall of the Khwarezmian Empire left Central Asia shattered and open to Mongol control. Yet the campaign did not end with the capture of its great cities. Genghis Khan pursued the conflict deep into Persia, determined to punish every corner of the empire that had defied him and to send an unmistakable message to the wider Islamic world. His armies, hardened by years of conquest, now turned their attention to regions that had long been considered secure behind deserts, mountains, and great cities. Persia was a land of contrasts. Fertile valleys and irrigated fields supported thriving agriculture, while deserts and mountains created natural barriers. Its cities were centers of scholarship, commerce, and religion, tied together by networks of roads and caravan routes. The Khwarezmian rulers had drawn wealth from these lands, but their collapse under Mongol assault left them exposed to devastation. The Mongol cavalry, swift and relentless, spread across the region in multiple columns, ensuring no stronghold could escape their attention. One of the most notable events of this campaign was the siege of Nishapur. This city, known for its culture and learning, resisted the Mongols fiercely. When it finally fell, the destruction was immense, remembered for centuries as a symbol of Mongol ferocity. Other cities met similar fates if they resisted, while those that surrendered were often spared wholesale destruction. The pattern repeated. Submission brought survival. Resistance brought ruin. The psychological impact of this policy was profound. Entire regions chose to yield without a fight, fearing the consequences of defiance. The Mongols demonstrated remarkable skill in logistics during this campaign. Armies moved across arid lands where supplies were scarce, yet discipline and planning kept them supplied. Scouts identified wells and pastures, herds provided meat and milk, and captured cities yielded stores of grain and goods. Engineers built bridges across rivers and siege engines for city assaults. By blending steppe mobility with careful planning, the Mongols overcame challenges that would have crippled less organized forces. The pursuit of the Khwarezmian Shah continued deep into Persia. Shah Ala-din Muhammad fled westward, abandoning his cities and people as the Mongols advanced. He crossed mountains and deserts in a desperate attempt to escape, but the relentless cavalry followed, striking at every refuge. Eventually, the Shah reached the Caspian Sea, where he died on a small island far from his throne and stripped of power. His death marked the final collapse of his authority, leaving Persia without a central ruler. With the Shah gone, resistance fragmented. Some cities attempted to defend themselves independently, while others sought to negotiate with the Mongols. Few succeeded in halting the advance. The armies moved methodically, reducing strongholds one by one. Bukhara and Samarkand had already fallen. Now cities like Ray, Hamadan, and others faced the same fate. The devastation spread fear across the Islamic world, reaching as far as Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo. News of Mongol conquests shocked neighboring powers. The Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad, watched nervously as Persia collapsed. The Khwarezmian Empire had served as a buffer between the steppe and the heart of the Islamic world. With that buffer gone, the Mongols stood at the gates of the Middle East. Merchants and travelers carried tales of entire cities destroyed, of population slaughtered, and of an army that seemed unstoppable. Yet even in the midst of destruction, Genghis Khan continued to build for the future. Skilled artisans, engineers, and scholars captured in Persia were spared and put to work. They brought knowledge of architecture, medicine, and administration, enriching the Mongol state. The empire expanded not only in territory, but also in its capacity to govern, absorb, and adapt. This blend of ferocity and pragmatism was central to Mongol success. The campaign into Persia also revealed the strategic vision of the Mongol leader. Rather than simply raiding and retreating, he dismantled the very structures of the Khwarezmian state. By removing its ruler, destroying its cities, and scattering its defenders, he ensured that no revival would threaten him from the west. This cleared the path for future expansion into the Middle East, laying the groundwork for campaigns that would reach the edges of Europe and the shores of the Mediterranean. For the Islamic world, the Mongol advance was a catastrophe of unprecedented scale. Entire regions that had flourished for centuries were thrown into turmoil. Trade routes were disrupted, populations displaced, and centers of learning destroyed. At the same time, the sheer speed and efficiency of the Mongols forced neighboring states to rethink their strategies. No longer could they dismiss the steppe horsemen as distant raiders. They now faced the reality of an empire that was expanding relentlessly, reshaping the balance of power across Asia. By the time the Persian campaign ended, the Mongols controlled a vast territory, stretching from northern China to the Iranian plateau. Their empire encompassed deserts, mountains, cities, and steppe, unified under the authority of Genghis Khan. The conquest of Persia demonstrated that no distance, no terrain, and no established power could resist the disciplined cavalry and ruthless strategy of the Mongols. This expansion set the stage for even greater confrontations. To the southwest lay the Islamic caliphates, guardians of some of the richest lands of the medieval world. To the west lay the steppes of Russia and the borders of Europe. The Mongol armies, tested in battle and hardened by conquest, now stood ready to push into regions that had never imagined facing horsemen from the far Mongolian plains. The conquest of Persia left the Mongols with a vast new domain and few immediate rivals strong enough to challenge them. But Genghis Khan and his generals were not content to stop at the Iranian plateau. Their armies pushed further west into the rugged terrain of the Caucasus and beyond, testing the strength of kingdoms and principalities that lay at the edge of Europe. For the first time, the Mongol horsemen would confront states that looked toward both Asia and Europe, drawing the attention of rulers far beyond their traditional sphere. The Caucasus region presented challenges unlike the open steppe. Towering mountains, narrow passes, and fortified towns made mobility more difficult. Yet Mongol strategy adapted. Scouts identified routes through the passes, and disciplined units advanced in coordinated waves. Local kingdoms, including Georgia and Armenia, resisted fiercely, drawing upon centuries of experience defending their lands from larger empires. But even their determination could not fully withstand the speed and coordination of Mongol forces. Raids devastated towns, fields were burned, and populations scattered. Though the Mongols did not establish permanent control here at once, they left a clear message: resistance carried heavy costs, and no region was beyond their reach. One of the most striking episodes of this westward thrust was the Mongols' clash with a coalition of powers on the steppes north of the Black Sea. Here they faced an alliance that included the Cumans, nomadic horsemen of the steppe, along with the armies of Kievan Rus principalities. These groups hoped to halt the Mongol advance before it spilled deeper into Europe. The Cumans, experienced in cavalry warfare, warned the Rus princes of the danger, describing the Mongols as relentless and nearly invincible. Yet many underestimated the scale of the threat. At the Battle of the Kulka River in 1223, Mongol generals Subutai and Jebi led a force against the coalition. The Mongols employed tactics they had perfected: feigned retreats to draw the enemy into pursuit, ambushes prepared in advance, and coordinated assaults by units that moved like parts of a single body. The coalition, confident in its numbers, chased the retreating Mongols, only to find itself encircled and overwhelmed. The result was a decisive Mongol victory. Thousands of Rus and Cuman warriors were killed, and the survivors carried home stories of devastation unlike anything they had seen before. The aftermath of Kulka River spread fear throughout Eastern Europe. The princes of Rus realized they faced a power unlike any they had encountered. The Cumans, once proud raiders themselves, were broken. Word of the Mongols traveled westward, reaching Hungary, Poland, and beyond. For the first time, European rulers began to hear consistent reports of a force rising from the east, conquering kingdoms, toppling empires, and leaving ruin in its wake. Though few in Europe yet understood the scope of the Mongol threat, the seeds of fear were planted. These campaigns also demonstrated the reach of Mongol strategy. They were not satisfied with victories close to home. Instead, they probed constantly, sending expeditions to test distant lands, learning about their defenses, and spreading their reputation. Even when they did not stay to occupy territory, the devastation left behind weakened rivals and ensured that future campaigns would meet less resistance. For Genghis Khan, the campaigns into the Caucasus and against the Rus were more than raids. They were demonstrations of power, proving to both allies and enemies that Mongol reach had no limits. From the cities of China to the mountains of Persia, from the steppes of Central Asia to the frontiers of Europe, his authority now cast a shadow across half the known world. The Mongol armies, returned from these campaigns with plunder, captives, and knowledge. They had tested new lands, measured the strength of distant states, and expanded their understanding of geography and politics. Artisans, scribes, and skilled workers were taken into Mongol service, adding to the empire's growing pool of talent. The empire became not only larger, but also more sophisticated, absorbing the skills of conquered peoples into its structure. The message to the world was unmistakable. No fortress was too strong, no kingdom too distant, and no army too large to resist the disciplined cavalry of Genghis Khan. The Mongol expansion was not random plunder. It was the systematic extension of an empire that sought to dominate all it encountered. By pushing into the Caucasus and striking at the Rus, the Mongols had made their presence felt on the doorstep of Europe. Though they withdrew temporarily to consolidate their gains elsewhere, they had opened a path that future generations of Mongol leaders would follow. The world was beginning to recognize that a new power had emerged from the steppe, one whose ambitions would not stop until every rival had been tested. By the middle of the 1220s, Genghis Khan was the master of the steppe, the conqueror of northern China, and the destroyer of Khwarezm. His empire stretched thousands of miles, uniting lands that had never before been joined under a single ruler. Yet even as his power seemed unshakable, new challenges emerged. One of the most serious came not from distant enemies, but from a neighbor he believed had already been subdued, the Tangut kingdom of Western Shah. Western Shah had first bowed to Mongol power in 1209, after the Mongols' early campaigns tested the strength of its fortresses and armies. The Tangut rulers had submitted, paid tribute, and promised loyalty. For years they remained under Mongol influence, providing soldiers and supplies when called upon. But as the Mongol Empire expanded westward, stretching toward Persia and Europe, the Tanguts began to reconsider their position. With Genghis Khan's forces engaged in distant wars, Western Shah saw an opportunity to defy the nomads who had humbled them nearly 2 decades earlier. The Tangut court calculated that the Mongol ruler was aging and that his empire was stretched thin. The Khwarezmian campaigns had taken vast armies far from the steppe, while the wars against the Jin continued to drain manpower. Tangut leaders believed they could resist Mongol demands and reassert their independence. They misjudged badly. When word reached Genghis Khan that Western Shah had withdrawn its support and openly defied his summons, he reacted with fury. For him, rebellion was more than defiance, it was betrayal, and betrayal could not be tolerated. An empire built on loyalty and submission could not allow an example of resistance so close to its heartland. In 1226, despite his age and the strain of decades of war, Genghis Khan mounted a final campaign to bring Western Shah to heel once and for all. The Mongol armies advanced into the Ordos region and the Hexi corridor, striking at the fortified towns that lined the Tangut kingdom. These cities were protected by strong walls and garrisons accustomed to defending against steppe raids. But the Mongols were no longer mere raiders. Years of campaigns in China, Central Asia, and Persia had taught them siege warfare. Engineers from conquered lands built catapults, trebuchets, and rams, while Mongol cavalry cut supply lines and devastated the countryside. City after city fell. The Tangut defenders resisted bravely, but the discipline and relentlessness of the Mongol war machine wore them down. The Mongols were systematic, reducing strongholds one at a time, ensuring that no pocket of resistance could survive to rally later. Refugees crowded into remaining fortresses, spreading hunger and disease. One of the most decisive battles came at the city of Haisha. The Mongols surrounded it, cutting off all supplies. Accounts describe relentless bombardments, fires raging within the walls, and defenders fighting desperately on the battlements. But the siege engines and coordinated assaults proved unstoppable. When Haisha fell, the devastation was total, sending shock waves through the remaining Tangut strongholds. By early 1227, the Tangut kingdom was on the verge of collapse. The capital, Zhongxing, was encircled. Inside, famine and despair gripped the population. The Tangut ruler finally agreed to surrender, but it was too late. Genghis Khan, determined to make an example, ordered the kingdom destroyed. Chroniclers record that the city was razed, its royal house extinguished, and much of its population killed or enslaved. Western Xia, once a proud state controlling vital trade routes, was erased from the map. This final campaign also revealed the harsh logic of Mongol strategy. Submission early could bring survival and even prosperity under Mongol protection. But defiance, especially after submission, had already been given once, brought annihilation. The destruction of Western Xia sent a clear message to every subject, people of the empire. Loyalty must be constant, and rebellion would not be forgiven. It was during this campaign, however, that Genghis Khan's own life came to an end. The exact circumstances remain a matter of debate. Some sources suggest he fell from his horse during battle and suffered injuries that led to his death. Others claim he succumbed to illness, perhaps aggravated by the rigors of the campaign. Later legends even spoke of secret wounds inflicted by Tangut defenders. Whatever the cause, by the summer of 1227, the great Khan's health was failing. As he lay dying, the campaign against Western Xia continued under his orders. Only after the kingdom was completely subdued did news of his death begin to circulate. Even then, it was kept secret from most of the army to ensure morale did not falter. His body was transported back toward Mongolia, its resting place kept hidden according to tradition. The fall of Western Xia marked both the final conquest of Genghis Khan's lifetime and the close of his extraordinary career. From the child abandoned by his clan to the ruler of the largest empire the world had yet seen, his life had spanned one of the most dramatic transformations in history. His death left questions of succession, strategy, and legacy that would soon shape the future of the Mongol world. But for the Tanguts, and for all who heard of their destruction, the message was unmistakable. The empire of Genghis Khan did not forgive betrayal. Its wrath was absolute, and its power could reach even the strongest fortress. The campaign against Western Xia had ended in devastation for the Tanguts, but for the Mongols, it marked the twilight of their leader's life. In the summer of 1227, as his armies tightened the noose around the last Tangut strongholds, Genghis Khan's health declined sharply. The exact cause has remained uncertain for centuries. Some chroniclers described a fall from horseback that left him badly injured, while others spoke of illness brought on by exhaustion and age. Later traditions embroidered the story with tales of wounds inflicted in secret by Tangut resistors. The truth may never be known, but what was clear was that the man who had ridden from obscurity to dominate half the known world was nearing his end. Even in his final days, the campaign did not falter. Orders were given in his name, sieges pressed with relentless determination, and the kingdom of Western Xia was systematically erased. The secrecy around his condition was deliberate, to reveal the Khan's failing health risked panic or hesitation among the troops. Instead, discipline was maintained, and the army carried on as if their leader still rode at its head. Only his closest commanders and attendants knew how grave his condition had become. When death finally came, it was in the midst of victory. Western Xia had fallen, its royal line extinguished, its cities destroyed, and its territory absorbed into the Mongol realm. The empire that Genghis Khan left behind stretched from the shores of the Pacific to the frontiers of Persia, from the forests of Siberia to the edges of India. It was larger than any empire the world had yet seen, and it had been forged in barely 2 decades of unbroken conquest. The Khan's body was transported back toward Mongolia under strict secrecy. Tradition dictated that his burial place remain unknown. According to legend, the funeral cortege killed anyone who witnessed its passage, ensuring that the route remained hidden. Some stories claimed that a river was diverted to cover his grave, while others suggested that the exact site was known only to a few trusted attendants. What is certain is that his resting place has never been discovered, remaining one of history's great mysteries. Before his death, Genghis Khan had made provisions for succession. His empire could not be left to chance. The unity he had built might collapse without a clear heir. His choice fell on his 3rd son, Ogedei. The decision was practical rather than sentimental. Though his eldest son, Jochi, commanded vast territories, doubts about his parentage, arising from his mother's earlier capture by the Marquette, cast a shadow over his legitimacy. Jochi himself died before his father, eliminating him from consideration. Chagatai, the 2nd son, was a skilled commander, but was known for his temper and inflexibility. To avoid rivalry between the surviving brothers, Genghis Khan selected Ogedei, respected for his balanced judgment and steady temperament. The choice was accepted during the Khan's lifetime, easing the transition after his death. Chagatai and the other brothers swore loyalty to Ogedei, and the wider family agreed to respect the decision. This unity was critical. Without it, the empire might have fractured into competing domains, as so many tribal confederations had before. With it, the Mongols maintained cohesion and continued their expansion under a single leader. The secrecy surrounding Genghis Khan's death lasted until Western Shah was completely destroyed. Only then was the news revealed. The army mourned, rituals were performed, and the eternal blue sky was invoked to honor the man who had risen from orphaned obscurity to command a continent. His life had been one of constant struggle, hardship, and victory, and his death was treated as both a personal loss and a world-shaking event. The succession of Ogedei ensured continuity, but it also opened new questions. How would the empire be managed now that its founder was gone? Would the balance between his sons hold, or would rivalries erupt? Could the Mongols continue their relentless conquests without the charisma and vision of the man who had created the empire? These uncertainties hung over the vast realm as the family gathered to confirm Ogedei's position. When the decision was ratified at a grand council, Ogedei was formally invested with the title of Great Khan. He inherited not only the armies and lands of his father, but also the responsibility to expand, govern, and preserve the empire's unity. For the generals and warriors who had served Genghis Khan, the transition brought reassurance. The laws, structures, and disciplines he had put in place were strong enough to outlast his life, at least for the moment. The death of Genghis Khan in 1227 marked the end of an era, but not the end of Mongol expansion. His successors would carry the conquests into Russia, the Middle East, and Europe, extending the empire to its greatest reach. Yet the figure of the founder loomed over everything they did. His name carried weight far beyond Mongolia, striking fear into cities from Baghdad to Kiev, and respect into courts from China to Persia. The empire he left was unique in its combination of ferocity and order, destruction and integration. For those who submitted early, life under Mongol rule could be secure and prosperous. For those who resisted, ruin followed. This balance of mercy and terror, discipline and ambition, defined his reign and became the template for the generations that followed. As Ogedei assumed power, the Mongols paused briefly to honor their founder. But rest was short-lived. The machinery of conquest that Genghis Khan had built was still in motion, and new campaigns were already being planned. The eternal blue sky had claimed the man, but the empire he forged continued to grow. When Ogedei assumed the title of Great Khan after his father's death in 1227, he inherited not only the largest empire in the world, but also the enormous challenge of holding it together. The empire stretched thousands of miles, encompassing steppe, desert, mountain, and city, home to nomads, farmers, and merchants of countless tongues. Unity had been the life's work of Genghis Khan. Continuity was now Ogedei's responsibility. Unlike his elder brothers, Jochi and Chagatai, Ogedei was not known for his ferocity in battle or his ambition for personal power. He was valued for steadiness, patience, and a talent for listening to advisors. These qualities, often overlooked in a world that prized warrior skill, proved essential in governing a realm that spanned continents. The generals and princes of the Mongol royal family accepted his authority with less resistance than might have arisen under a harsher or more divisive leader. One of Ogedei's first tasks was to complete unfinished business in China. Though the Jin dynasty had suffered devastating defeats under his father, parts of northern China remained outside Mongol control. The Jin clung to fortified strongholds, relying on walls, rivers, and the wealth of their agricultural base. Ogedei launched fresh campaigns to finish what Genghis Khan had begun. Mongol cavalry again devastated the countryside, cutting off supplies and forcing defenders into their cities. Siegecraft, now refined through years of practice, wore down fortress after fortress. By 1234, the Jin dynasty collapsed entirely. With its fall, the Mongols gained control of northern China, one of the wealthiest regions in the world. This conquest added vast resources to the empire: fertile farmland, large populations for taxation and conscription, and cities filled with artisans, scribes, and engineers. Yet ruling such lands required more than military might. Ogedei strengthened the administrative framework that his father had begun. Census-taking was expanded to include newly conquered territories. Governors were appointed to oversee taxation, enforce laws, and ensure loyalty. Relay stations multiplied, binding the empire together with faster communication. Trade flourished as roads became safer, and merchants moved under Mongol protection from the Pacific coast to the edge of Europe. At the same time, Ogedei continued to respect the traditions of the steppe. Councils of nobles still met to debate major decisions, and loyalty was rewarded with lands, titles, and shares of tribute. The balance between innovation and tradition, begun under Genghis Khan, allowed the Mongols to govern both nomadic herders and sedentary farmers without alienating either group. While consolidating in China, Ogedei also turned attention westward. The defeat of the Khwarezmian Empire had opened the road into Persia, but it also created new challenges. Local rulers and city-states attempted to fill the vacuum left by the Shah's fall. To secure these regions, Mongol armies struck deep into Persia once more, reminding all that Mongol authority was permanent. Skilled administrators were placed in charge of tribute collection, while artisans and engineers were relocated to centers where their talents could serve the empire. Perhaps the most dramatic expansion under Ogedei came in Eastern Europe. His generals Subutai and Batu, son of Jochi, led massive campaigns across the steppes of Russia. Cities such as Ryazan, Vladimir, and Kiev were besieged and destroyed in the early 1240s. The disciplined Mongol cavalry crushed coalition after coalition of Rus princes, demonstrating again that fragmented resistance could not withstand unified assault. The destruction of Kiev in 1240 was particularly symbolic, as it had been a center of Slavic culture for centuries. Its fall sent shockwaves across Europe, convincing neighboring kingdoms that the Mongols were an unstoppable force. From the Ruslands, the armies advanced further west, striking Poland and Hungary. At the Battle of Legnica in 1241, Mongol forces defeated a combined army of European knights and soldiers, killing thousands and scattering the survivors. Days later, at the Battle of Moky in Hungary, another massive victory demonstrated the superiority of Mongol tactics over European heavy cavalry. The use of feigned retreats, coordinated assaults, and encirclements left European armies bewildered and crushed. Panic spread across the continent. From Vienna to Rome, rulers feared that Mongol cavalry would soon pour into the heart of Europe. Chroniclers described entire regions gripped by dread, with some believing that the horsemen were a scourge sent by God to punish Christendom. Yet at the height of this advance, with the gates of Europe seemingly open, the Mongols withdrew. The reason was not defeat, but succession. In 1241, Ogedei died in Mongolia, and the news reached the generals on campaign. By tradition, the princes of the royal family had to return home for a council to select the next great Khan. Expansion paused, and the armies turned back. Europe was spared, not by military success, but by the internal needs of the Mongol state. Ogedei's reign demonstrated that the empire could survive the death of its founder and continue to grow. Under his leadership, the Mongols completed the conquest of the Jin dynasty, secured Persia, and nearly brought Europe to its knees. His willingness to delegate, his steadiness in judgment, and his reliance on capable generals ensured that the empire did not fracture. By the time of his death, the Mongol Empire was larger and richer than when he had inherited it, a testament to continuity in the face of enormous challenges. The succession after Ogedei would prove more turbulent as rivalries among the family deepened. But for nearly a decade and a half, his leadership carried forward the vision of unity and expansion. The empire remained unstoppable, and the legacy of Genghis Khan continued to shape the fate of nations far beyond Mongolia. The sudden death of Ogedei Khan in 1241 halted Mongol armies at the very edge of Europe. Generals who had just shattered Hungarian and Polish defenses pulled back, not because they had been stopped, but because tradition demanded their presence at the heart of the empire. The death of a great Khan was not merely a moment of mourning, it was a turning point that required a new ruler to be chosen at a great council. Without that decision, the unity of the empire could not be guaranteed. The pause revealed both the strength and fragility of the Mongol system. Strength, because even armies poised to conquer new lands obeyed the command to return, recognizing the authority of the wider family and the laws laid down by Genghis Khan. Fragility, because the succession was never simple. The empire was ruled not by a single line, but by a family whose branches each commanded powerful armies and vast territories. With Ogedei gone, competition among the descendants of Genghis Khan grew fierce. His widow, Turagain, acted quickly to secure the throne for her son Gayuk. As regent, she wielded power for several years, managing the affairs of the empire and building alliances among influential nobles. The delay in selecting a successor reflected the complexity of Mongol politics. Every decision required negotiation among the different branches of the royal family. The descendants of Yochi, Chagatai, and Ogedei all had claims, and each line guarded its interests closely. Meanwhile, the empire continued to function. The administrative systems established earlier kept tribute flowing, merchants safe, and armies supplied. The relay stations carried news from the frontiers to Karakoram, the capital built under Ogedei's reign. Envoys from distant lands still traveled to the Mongol court, seeking favor or attempting to negotiate peace. But the absence of a single great Khan limited the scope of new campaigns. Expansion slowed as family politics dominated attention. When Gayuk was finally confirmed as Great Khan in 1246, the empire seemed set to resume its outward push. He was known for his ambition and his confidence, qualities that could both inspire and unsettle. His rule, however, proved short. Internal disputes and his early death in 1248 left the throne vacant once again, throwing the empire back into uncertainty. The struggle for succession revealed deep fissures. Rival branches of the family maneuvered for advantage, with the house of Tolui, Genghis Khan's youngest son, emerging as the strongest contender. Tolui himself had died earlier, but his sons, including Mongol, Kublai, and Hulagu, were rising figures with loyal supporters. The stage was set for another decisive council, one that would determine not only who ruled the Mongols, but also the future direction of their conquests. In 1251, Mongke, son of Tolui, was chosen as Great Khan. His election marked a shift in power, giving the Toluid line prominence over the descendants of Ogadai and Chagatai. For some princes, the decision was contentious, but Mongke acted swiftly to secure his authority. Rival claimants were removed or suppressed, and loyalty was demanded from all branches of the family. The empire, once again, had a single recognized ruler. Mongke's accession brought renewed energy to Mongol expansion. He had inherited not only the structures of government, but also the ambition of his grandfather. Under his direction, campaigns resumed on a grand scale. He assigned his brother Hulagu to lead an army into the Middle East, while another brother, Kublai, turned his focus to the conquest of southern China. Subbutai's earlier vision of simultaneous offensives on multiple fronts was revived, with armies striking in different directions at once. The empire's ability to recover from succession crises and return to expansion demonstrated its resilience. While rival dynasties in other parts of the world often fractured after the death of a strong ruler, the Mongols managed, despite fierce disputes, to re-establish unity under a new Great Khan. The laws and institutions established earlier, the loyalty of generals, and the momentum of conquest all played a part in keeping the empire together. Yet the struggles also hinted at the difficulties to come. Each succession brought arguments, rivalries, and the risk of division. The larger the empire grew, the more complicated the politics became. Princes ruled territories thousands of miles apart, commanding armies and treasuries that gave them independent power. Holding such a vast family together under one throne required constant effort, and every transition of leadership risked tearing it apart. For the moment, however, Mongke's rise restored direction. The empire was united once more, its resources vast, its armies undefeated. The world beyond Mongolia, from the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad to the Song dynasty in China, would soon feel the full weight of renewed Mongol campaigns. Once Mongke secured his place as Great Khan in 1251, the empire regained its sense of direction. He was determined to prove that the Mongol war machine had not lost its momentum after years of succession disputes. Rather than focusing on a single theater, Mongke revived the grand strategy of launching simultaneous campaigns on multiple fronts. The idea was simple: overwhelm enemies by striking in different directions at once, ensuring no rival power could unite against the Mongols. To the south, the Song dynasty still controlled much of China. Though the Jin had been destroyed, the Song remained wealthy and populous, ruling fertile lands along the Yangtze River. Mongke entrusted his brother Kublai with the responsibility of breaking the Song's resistance. Kublai established his base in the north, and began systematic preparations for conquest. His approach combined the lessons of earlier campaigns with innovations suited to the terrain of southern China. Siege engines were readied for the fortified cities, and river fleets were constructed to challenge the Song on water. Steppe cavalry alone could not conquer the south. It required adaptation, patience, and careful planning. While Kublai turned toward China, another brother, Hulagu, was tasked with marching west. His destination was the Islamic world, where the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad remained a center of religion and culture. Before reaching Baghdad, Hulagu first confronted the powerful fortress cities of Persia and the Caucasus that had resisted earlier Mongol advances. He brought with him a massive army, said to be among the largest ever assembled by the Mongols and supported by engineers from across Asia who constructed siege engines capable of breaking even the strongest fortifications. In 1258, Hulagu's forces reached Baghdad. The city, seat of the caliphs for centuries, was both a political and spiritual heart of the Islamic world. The Mongols surrounded it, cutting off supplies and battering the walls with catapults. Despite the prestige of the city, its defenses crumbled under relentless assault. When Baghdad fell, the devastation was immense. The caliph was executed, libraries and institutions were destroyed, and survivors were left to remember the terror of Mongol vengeance. The fall of Baghdad shocked the entire Muslim world, marking the end of the Abbasid Caliphate as a major power. From Baghdad, Hulagu pushed further into the Middle East. His armies subdued Syria, capturing Aleppo and Damascus, and threatened Egypt. The advance seemed unstoppable, with Mongol banners appearing in lands that had never imagined invasion from the distant steppe. Yet the westward campaign eventually reached its limit. In 1260, at the Battle of Ain Jalut in Palestine, a Mongol force was defeated by the Mamluks of Egypt. It was the first significant setback suffered by a Mongol army in open battle. Though Hulagu still controlled vast territories, Ain Jalut showed that Mongol expansion was not infinite. Back in China, Kublai pressed steadily against the Song. His armies advanced city by city, supported by engineers and administrators who managed newly conquered territories. The Mongols adapted to the challenges of river warfare, employing ships and naval tactics learned from captured sailors. Progress was slow, but the balance of power shifted gradually in their favor. Kublai also took steps to win over Chinese officials and scholars, presenting himself not only as a conqueror, but as a legitimate ruler. This combination of force and diplomacy distinguished his approach from earlier Mongol leaders. Mongke himself oversaw both eastern and western campaigns, traveling to China to direct operations against the Song while maintaining correspondence with Hulagu in the Middle East. His leadership style emphasized delegation. He trusted his brothers with great responsibility, but kept the ultimate authority in his own hands. Under his rule, the empire stretched from Korea to Syria, from the forests of Siberia to the plains of northern India. Few empires in history had ever approached such scale. Yet Mongke's reign was not without strain. Coordinating campaigns across such distances tested the limits of communication and logistics. Maintaining loyalty among princes who commanded large armies far from the center required constant negotiation. The victories were immense, but the costs were heavy. Armies consumed vast resources, and conquered lands required careful administration to prevent rebellion. Even with the systems established by his grandfather and father, the empire struggled at times to balance expansion with stability. In 1259, while leading operations in China, Mongke fell ill and died. His sudden death created an immediate crisis. Just as Ogedei's passing had halted the Mongols in Europe, Mongke's death interrupted the great campaigns of his era. Hulagu, upon hearing the news, pulled back from the edge of Egypt to secure his position. Kublai, still locked in conflict with the Song, faced the challenge of returning north to participate in the succession struggle. The vast empire, once again, stood at a crossroads, its unity threatened by the absence of a single leader. Mongke's reign had demonstrated both the power and the vulnerability of the Mongol system. Under his leadership, the empire had reached its maximum geographical extent, touching nearly every major civilization of Eurasia. Yet his death revealed how fragile that unity could be. The question of succession, once more, would determine whether the empire held together or fractured into competing realms. The death of Mongol Khan in 1259 created another crisis for the Mongol Empire. His passing left no clear successor, and the empire once again faced the dangerous prospect of division among competing branches of the family. For decades, the Mongols had expanded outward almost without pause, but each death of a great Khan brought attention back to the heart of the steppe, where legitimacy had to be settled before further conquests could continue. Two strong claimants emerged. In the north, Arik Bok, the youngest son of Tolui and brother to Mongke and Kublai, gathered support from traditional Mongol nobles. He was based in Karakorum, the capital built by Ogedei, and presented himself as the guardian of steppe traditions. Many princes, who valued the old ways, rallied to his side, seeing in him a defender of Mongol identity against the growing influence of sedentary cultures. To the east, Kublai had been deeply involved in campaigns against the Song dynasty in China. He had already begun to adopt aspects of Chinese governance, relying on local officials and presenting himself as a ruler in the Chinese style. His supporters included not only Mongol generals, but also scholars and administrators from conquered Chinese territories. Kublai's vision extended beyond the steppe. He sought to govern as emperor of a multi-ethnic empire, combining Mongol strength with Chinese institutions. The clash between Arik Bok and Kublai was not merely a family quarrel. It represented a fundamental choice about the direction of the Mongol Empire. Would it remain centered on the traditions of the steppe, or would it transform into a state that embraced the institutions of conquered civilizations? In 1260, both brothers held separate councils to declare themselves Great Khan. Arik Bok was proclaimed in Karakorum, while Kublai convened his supporters further east and received recognition there. For the first time, the empire had two rival claimants, each backed by powerful factions. The stage was set for civil war. The conflict between Kublai and Arik Bok stretched over several years. Battles were fought across Mongolia and northern China, with supply lines, alliances, and loyalty constantly shifting. Arik Bok controlled the symbolic capital, but Kublai controlled richer lands, larger populations, and more developed administrative structures. His base in northern China gave him access to grain, resources, and manpower far beyond what the steppe alone could provide. At the same time, the empire was already beginning to fragment. Hulagu remained in the Middle East, focused on consolidating his own domain after the fall of Baghdad. Batu's descendants ruled the Golden Horde in the western steppes, centered on the Volga River. While they still recognized the authority of a great Khan in principle, their immediate loyalty was to their own leaders. The unity that had once characterized Mongol expansion was giving way to regional interests. Kublai eventually gained the upper hand. His forces defeated Arik Boka's armies, and by 1264, Arik Boka was forced to surrender. Though he was treated with some measure of respect, his defeat marked the end of his claim to the throne. Kublai emerged as the uncontested Great Khan, though his rule was never accepted equally by all branches of the family. The Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate in Persia acknowledged him in name, but their independence in practice grew steadily. The victory of Kublai brought profound changes. He shifted the center of power permanently away from the steppe and into China. He declared the foundation of the Yuan dynasty in 1271, ruling as emperor in the Chinese tradition, while still maintaining his title as Great Khan. This dual identity, Mongol conqueror and Chinese emperor, signaled a transformation in the empire's nature. For many Mongols, the shift was unsettling. Karakoram, once the heart of the realm, was no longer the seat of power. Nomadic traditions were overshadowed by bureaucratic institutions, Chinese customs, and a growing emphasis on governing cities rather than pastures. Yet for Kublai, this change was essential. The wealth, population, and resources of China offered a foundation far stronger than the shifting loyalties of the steppe. The succession struggle also exposed the limits of the empire's unity. While Kublai had won, the time when a single Khan could direct every campaign across Eurasia was gone. The empire remained vast, but its regions, China, Persia, the Russian steppes, and Central Asia, began to operate more independently. The dream of a unified Mongol state under one ruler had faded, replaced by a looser collection of khanates, each powerful in its own right, but increasingly separate. Still, in the 1260s, Kublai's victory gave the empire a new direction. He would devote his reign to the conquest of the Song dynasty, the governance of China, and the attempt to integrate a multi-ethnic empire under Mongol rule. The era of explosive conquest that had begun with Genghis Khan was slowing, but the Mongols remained the most powerful force of their age, their influence felt from Europe to the Pacific. After defeating Arikhbok and securing his position as Great Khan, Kublai turned his attention fully to the south. The Song dynasty, which still ruled much of China, remained wealthy, populous, and determined to resist Mongol domination. Conquering the Song would not only complete the task his grandfather had begun, but also provide Kublai with the richest and most advanced territory in Asia. To rule China as emperor, he needed to break the last great power standing in his way. The Song dynasty presented challenges unlike those faced against steppe rivals, or even the Jin. Its population numbered in the tens of millions. Its bureaucracy was sophisticated, and its defenses were formidable. The Yangtze River acted as a natural barrier, and its cities were protected by strong walls and large garrisons. The Song also possessed significant naval strength, with fleets patrolling rivers and coastlines. For the Mongols, who excelled on land, this posed a new obstacle. Kublai prepared carefully. He recruited Chinese engineers, Persian craftsmen, and even defected Song officials to build the infrastructure needed for conquest. Siege engines, capable of hurling massive stones, were constructed, and shipyards produced vessels that allowed Mongol forces to challenge Song fleets. The campaign would be long and difficult, but Kublai's combination of military force and administrative planning set the foundation for success. The war unfolded in stages. Northern strongholds fell first, as Mongol armies advanced methodically down the valleys. Cities that resisted were besieged, bombarded, and eventually taken, while those that surrendered were often spared. Each victory gave the Mongols new resources, soldiers, and strategic positions from which to press further south. One of the major turning points came in 1273 with the siege of Sangyang, a fortress city guarding the approaches to the Yangtze River. The city had resisted Mongol assaults for years, serving as a linchpin of Song defenses. To capture it, the Mongols brought in engineers from the Middle East, who built giant counterweight trebuchets capable of smashing through the thick walls. After months of bombardment, the defenses gave way, and Shenyang fell. This victory opened the path into the heart of the Song realm. With the Yangtze crossed, the Mongols advanced deeper into southern China. Resistance was fierce. Song generals and officials rallied defenders, employing river fleets to harass Mongol supply lines and fortifications to slow their advance. But the Mongol army had become an institution of enormous resilience. Cavalry dominated the open countryside, siege engines battered cities, and naval forces, though less experienced, gradually learned to counter the Song fleets. The combined pressure wore down resistance year by year. Kublai also employed diplomacy. He sought to win over Chinese scholars, officials, and generals, offering positions in his administration to those who submitted. Many accepted, preferring to preserve their families and communities rather than face destruction. By blending force with co-option, Kublai steadily undermined Song unity. The final act of the war came in 1276, when Mongol armies surrounded the Song capital of Lenan, present-day Hangzhou. Facing overwhelming odds, the young Song emperor surrendered. Though remnants of resistance survived in the south for a few more years, the dynasty was effectively finished. By 1279, the last Song loyalists were defeated at the Battle of Yamen, where their fleet was destroyed, and the last child emperor drowned or disappeared in the chaos. With this victory, China was fully united under Mongol rule. Kublai declared the founding of the Yuan dynasty in 1271, even before the final defeat of the Song, and now his claim was complete. As emperor, he ruled not merely as a steppe conqueror, but as a Chinese sovereign, adopting the trappings of Chinese governance and culture. The capital was moved to what is now Beijing, where a grand city was built to reflect both Mongol power and Chinese tradition. The conquest of the Song marked the culmination of decades of Mongol expansion in East Asia. It demonstrated their ability not only to dominate open plains and deserts, but also to adapt to the challenges of rivers, fleets, and walled cities. It also revealed the transformation of the Mongol Empire. What had begun as a nomadic confederation under Genghis Khan had become a dynasty, ruling the world's most populous and sophisticated civilization. Yet this transformation carried costs. Many Mongols resented the shift toward sedentary ways, the emphasis on bureaucracy, and the loss of the steppe as the center of power. The empire that had once ridden with unmatched unity now contained tensions between tradition and adaptation, between the demands of nomadic heritage and the realities of ruling vast settled populations. Still, the conquest of the Song was one of the greatest achievements of the Mongol age. With it, Kublai stood as ruler of all China, commanding resources that no Mongol before him had possessed. The dream of Genghis Khan had reached its fullest expression in the east, even as the empire elsewhere was beginning to fragment into separate khanates. With the fall of the Song dynasty and the establishment of the Yuan dynasty in 1271, Kublai Khan stood as the ruler of all China. No steppe leader before him had held such authority. He was still the great Khan of the Mongols, but his identity now rested equally on being emperor in the Chinese tradition. This dual role defined his reign, shaping both his achievements and the challenges he faced. Kublai understood that conquering China was only the first step. Governing it required legitimacy in the eyes of its vast population, whose tradition stretched back thousands of years. To secure that legitimacy, he adopted many features of Chinese rule. He built a new capital at Dadu, on the site of modern Beijing, designed with wide avenues, palaces, and walls that reflected Chinese imperial grandeur. The city became a symbol of Mongol power, transformed into Chinese authority. He reorganized government to include Chinese officials alongside Mongol administrators. The empire was divided into provinces, with appointed governors. Taxes were standardized, and censuses were conducted to track households, land, and resources. Yet while he embraced Chinese institutions, he also preserved Mongol privileges. Mongols remained the ruling elite, with greater legal rights and access to key positions. Below them ranked Central Asians and foreigners brought into service, while Han Chinese occupied lower rungs of the hierarchy. This layered system reflected both the inclusiveness and the divisions of his rule. Economically, Kublai promoted agriculture and trade. Irrigation systems were repaired, fields restored, and granaries maintained to stabilize food supplies. He supported merchants by guaranteeing safe passage and encouraging the use of paper money, a system already in place under earlier Chinese dynasties, but expanded under Mongol rule. Caravans moved with relative safety across Asia, carrying silk, spices, and precious metals. Foreign visitors arrived in China in greater numbers, drawn by both opportunity and curiosity about the vast Mongol Empire. One of the most famous visitors was Marco Polo, the Venetian traveler who arrived at Kublai's court in the late 13th century. His accounts, later recorded in Europe, described the wealth of the Yuan capital, the efficiency of its postal system, and the vastness of the empire. Whether every detail was accurate or not, his stories captured European imaginations and spread the image of Kublai Khan as a ruler of unmatched power and sophistication. Kublai also pursued further expansion. To the east, he attempted to bring Japan under Mongol influence. Twice, in 1274 and 1271, massive fleets were sent across the sea, carrying tens of thousands of soldiers. The invasions met fierce Japanese resistance, but they were ultimately undone by storms that wrecked much of the fleet. Japanese chroniclers later called these storms kamikaze, or divine winds, believing they had been sent by the gods to protect the islands. The failed invasions were a rare check on Mongol ambition. In Southeast Asia, Mongol armies campaigned in Vietnam, Burma, and Java. They won battles and imposed tribute in some regions, but the terrain, climate, and resistance of local populations made permanent control difficult. The jungles and monsoon rains were unlike the open plains where Mongol cavalry excelled. These campaigns demonstrated both the global reach of Mongol ambition and the limits of their effectiveness in unfamiliar environments. Within China, Kublai worked to balance his Mongol identity with his role as Chinese emperor. He patronized Buddhism, which held appeal both for Mongols and for many Chinese, while also respecting Confucian traditions that underpinned Chinese governance. He relied on scholars to help run the bureaucracy, while continuing to reward Mongol generals and nobles with privileges. This balance was delicate, and not all groups were satisfied. Some Chinese resented foreign rule, while some Mongols complained that their Khan had become too Chinese. Despite these tensions, Kublai's reign brought stability to a vast region. Roads and canals were maintained, trade thrived, and the Yuan court became a center of culture and exchange. Artists, scholars, and craftsmen from across Asia came to Dadu, making it one of the most cosmopolitan cities of its age. The empire's scale and diversity were unmatched, uniting lands from Korea to Persia under a network of administration and commerce. Yet the empire was no longer the tightly unified force it had been under Genghis Khan. The Western Khanates, the Golden Horde in Russia, and the Ilkhanate in Persia, acknowledged Kublai in name, but operated independently in practice. Coordination across such distances proved impossible, and family rivalries deepened. The Mongol Empire was becoming a collection of states rather than a single entity. Kublai himself ruled until 1294, his long reign marked by both triumph and strain. His efforts to govern China as a dynasty in its own right ensured the survival of Mongol power in East Asia for decades. But the costs of constant war, the burden of administration, and the growing distance between the Mongols of the steppe and the Mongols in China foreshadowed challenges to come. The vision of a global empire remained alive in Kublai's time, but the reality was shifting. Expansion slowed, unity weakened, and the empire began to settle into the difficult task of ruling what had already been conquered. The Mongols were no longer only conquerors on horseback. They had become rulers of cities, fields, and millions of subjects whose traditions were far older than their own. When Kublai Khan died in 1294, he left behind a realm that was vast but no longer united in the way it had been under his grandfather. As emperor of the Yuan dynasty, Kublai had established Mongol rule firmly in China, but the other branches of the family were pursuing their own paths. The dream of a single empire, governed from one center, was slipping away. What remained was a constellation of khanates, each claiming descent from Genghis Khan, but each increasingly independent. In the west, the descendants of Jochi ruled the Golden Horde. Their territory stretched across the Russian steppes, from the Volga River to the Black Sea. From their capital at Sarai, they controlled trade routes that connected Europe with Asia. The Horde extracted tribute from the principalities of Rus, shaping their politics for centuries to come. While they still invoked the authority of the Great Khan in name, their loyalty to Kublai's Yuan court was distant at best. Their interests lay in securing trade, dominating steppe rivals, and expanding influence into Eastern Europe. To the south, Hulagu's descendants ruled the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Middle East. Their campaigns had destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate, and from their base in Tabriz, they governed lands that included much of modern Iran, Iraq, and parts of Anatolia. The Ilkhans faced constant challenges from local populations, religious tensions, and the rising power of the Mamluks in Egypt. Though they occasionally cooperated with other Mongol states, their position was increasingly shaped by the politics of the Islamic world, rather than by loyalty to the Great Khan in China. In Central Asia, the descendants of Chagatai held sway. Their khanate stretched across the heart of the steppe, including parts of modern Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and western China. The Chagatai Khanate maintained steppe traditions more closely than the Yuan or the Ilkhans, but even here, the connection to a central Mongol authority was weak. Rivalries between princes and the pressures of governing diverse peoples often destabilized their rule. In China, the Yuan dynasty remained strong in the immediate aftermath of Kublai's death. His successors continued to rule from Dadu, maintaining Chinese institutions while preserving Mongol privileges. Yet the strain of governing such a vast population, combined with natural disasters, economic difficulties, and resentment of foreign rule, planted seeds of unrest. Over time, the Yuan would face growing resistance from Chinese subjects who never fully accepted Mongol domination. The division of the empire into khanates was not immediate collapse. Trade still connected the different regions, and cultural exchanges continued to flourish. Merchants could travel from Europe to China, with relative safety under Mongol protection, and ideas, technologies, and goods flowed across Eurasia. The Pax Mongolica, as it came to be known, allowed an unprecedented level of interaction between East and West. Yet politically, the unity of command was gone. Each khanate developed its own character. The Golden Horde became deeply involved in the politics of Russia and Eastern Europe, influencing the rise of Moscow as a regional power. The Ilkhans engaged with Persia's Islamic traditions, eventually converting to Islam themselves and integrating into the cultural fabric of the region. The Chagatai Khanate maintained a more nomadic character, while the Yuan dynasty attempted to balance Mongol rule with Chinese imperial traditions. Disputes between the khanates sometimes erupted into open conflict. The Ilkhans and the Golden Horde clashed over control of the Caucasus, while the Yuan court attempted, without much success, to assert superiority over its western cousins. The unity of the empire was replaced by a network of related but rival states, each proud of its descent from Genghis Khan, but unwilling to submit to the authority of another branch. Despite these divisions, the Mongol legacy remained immense. The structures built by Genghis Khan and his successors allowed vast territories to remain connected. Trade routes were maintained, envoys still crossed the steppe, and cultural exchanges flourished. For a time, the fragmentation of political power did not end the broader system of interaction created under Mongol rule. But the long-term consequences of division were clear. Without a single guiding authority, the Khanates pursued their own interests, often at the expense of unity. Local traditions, religions, and rivalries shaped their development more than the memory of the Great Khan. What had once been the largest continuous empire in history was now becoming a family of separate states. The passing of Kublai Khan marked the end of the Mongol Empire as a unified force. The Yuan, the Ilkhanate, the Chagatai Khanate, and the Golden Horde would each leave their own mark on history, but the era of a single empire stretching unbroken across Eurasia was over. Even as the Mongol Empire fractured into separate khanates, the legacy of conquest created conditions that transformed Eurasia. For more than a century, a vast corridor stretching from the Pacific to the Mediterranean enjoyed a level of stability rare in history. Merchants, envoys, missionaries, and travelers could cross thousands of miles with relative safety. This period became known as the Pax Mongolica, or Mongol Peace, a time when the world seemed smaller and more connected than ever before. The foundation of this peace lay in the systems created under Genghis Khan and maintained by his successors. Relay stations dotted the main routes, providing fresh horses, food, and shelter. Passes stamped with official seals allowed merchants and envoys to move through different khanates with protection. Banditry, once a constant danger, was punished severely. Even as political unity weakened, the Mongol states recognized the value of maintaining these networks, for they brought wealth and prestige to all. Trade flourished. Caravans carried silk from China, spices from India, furs from Siberia, and glassware from the Middle East. Silver from Central Asia circulated widely, while paper money, issued by the Yuan dynasty, traveled along with merchants. Ports on the Indian Ocean linked with caravan routes across the steppe, creating a global web of commerce. Italian city-states, such as Genoa and Venice, established trading posts in the Black Sea, connecting European markets with goods from as far away as China. The increased flow of goods was matched by the movement of people and ideas. Artisans and scholars traveled with caravans, bringing technologies and knowledge across cultural boundaries. Gunpowder, printing, and compass navigation, developed in China, spread westward. Mathematics, astronomy, and medicine from the Islamic world found their way into Europe. The Mongols themselves valued skilled workers, often relocating them to serve in their courts, unintentionally accelerating the exchange of knowledge. Diplomatic missions became common. The Khanates dispatched envoys to European rulers, sometimes seeking alliances against common enemies, sometimes demanding submission. Popes and kings sent representatives east, hoping to learn more about the mysterious empire that had shaken Europe's borders. These exchanges expanded horizons, introducing new awareness of distant lands and peoples. One of the most famous examples of cultural contact during the Pax Mongolica was the journey of Marco Polo. The Venetian traveler reached the court of Kublai Khan in the late 13th century, and later described what he saw in vivid detail. His accounts spoke of the wealth of China, the efficiency of the postal system, and the diversity of the empire. Though some of his stories were exaggerated or misunderstood, they shaped European perceptions of Asia for generations. He was not the only traveler. Persian historians, Muslim merchants, and Chinese officials also left records of journeys that connected distant parts of the Mongol world. Religion spread along these routes as well. Buddhist monks traveled from India and Tibet into China. Muslim scholars moved into Central Asia and the Yuan court, and Nestorian Christians reached as far as Mongolia. The Khanates often tolerated multiple religions, allowing temples, mosques, and churches to operate side by side. This openness, rooted in the Mongols' own traditions of shamanism and pragmatism, created an atmosphere in which exchange was possible. Yet the Pax Mongolica carried risks. The same routes that spread goods and knowledge also spread disease. In the mid-14th century, the bubonic plague, later known as the Black Death, traveled along trade and military routes from Central Asia to Europe. The pandemic devastated populations across continents, killing millions and reshaping societies. The connections fostered by Mongol rule, so beneficial in trade and culture, also made the world vulnerable to global crises. Despite these dangers, the impact of the Pax Mongolica was profound. For the first time, Eurasia functioned as a connected system, with goods, ideas, and people moving more freely than ever before. The Mongols had not intended to create this network for the benefit of others. Their aim had been conquest and tribute. But the structures they built and enforced produced conditions that transformed global history. Even as the Khanate drifted apart politically, the shared heritage of Mongol rule kept these systems alive. Merchants and travelers continued to rely on Mongol protections, and rulers recognized the wealth that came from encouraging long-distance trade. The flow of knowledge during this period helped lay the groundwork for the Renaissance in Europe and the expansion of science and technology across the Old World. The Pax Mongolica was a paradox. Born from conquest and destruction, it produced an era of connection and exchange. The horsemen of the steppe, who had once seemed only a threat to civilization, became the unexpected guardians of roads, caravans, and communication. Their empire, though divided, had reshaped the map of Eurasia in ways that would echo long after their power faded. The Yuan dynasty, established by Kublai Khan, represented the high point of Mongol power in East Asia. For decades after its founding, it maintained control over the vast and wealthy lands of China. Yet beneath the surface of stability, strains were building. The very factors that had allowed the Mongols to conquer and rule such a massive population now became sources of weakness. By the mid-14th century, the Yuan dynasty was in decline, challenged by rebellion, natural disaster, and the limits of foreign rule over a deeply rooted civilization. One of the central problems was legitimacy. While Kublai had presented himself as a Chinese emperor, many Chinese subjects never fully accepted the Mongols as rightful rulers. The Yuan administration placed Mongols and Central Asians above native Chinese in a rigid social hierarchy, with the majority population excluded from many positions of power. Though some Chinese officials rose to prominence, resentment lingered among scholars, farmers, and commoners who felt their traditions and rights had been displaced. Economic challenges deepened discontent. Maintaining an empire of this scale required enormous resources. The Mongol court in Dadu was lavish, supporting a cosmopolitan mix of officials, scholars, artisans, and foreign visitors. Campaigns in Southeast Asia and other distant lands consumed wealth without always producing lasting gains. To fund these expenses, taxes increased, falling heavily on the Chinese peasantry. Paper currency, once an innovative tool of the yuan, was over-issued, leading to inflation and loss of confidence. Natural disasters struck repeatedly. Floods along the Yellow River devastated farmland, while droughts reduced harvests in other regions. Famine spread, and with famine came unrest, in a society already strained by taxation and discrimination. These disasters were seen not simply as accidents of nature, but as signs that the dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven, the traditional justification for imperial authority in Chinese thought. Corruption and inefficiency within the Yuan bureaucracy worsened the situation. While Kublai had sought to balance Mongol and Chinese practices, his successors struggled to maintain the same level of discipline. Powerful officials enriched themselves, regional administrators neglected their duties, and communication between the center and the provinces faltered. The effectiveness that had once distinguished Mongol governance eroded, replaced by uncertainty and disorder. Resistance movements began to appear, often cloaked in religious or millenarian language. Secret societies, inspired by Buddhist and Taoist visions of renewal, gained followers among the poor and dispossessed. The most significant of these was the Red Turban Rebellion, which erupted in the 1350s, drawing support from peasants, disaffected soldiers, and local leaders. The rebels combined social protest with the promise of restoring native Chinese rule. Their red scarves became a symbol of defiance against Mongol authority. The Yuan dynasty still commanded formidable resources. Mongol cavalry remained powerful, and the dynasty controlled many of the richest cities of the world. But the rebellion spread quickly, fueled by widespread resentment and the inability of the central government to respond effectively. Rival warlords rose, carving out territories and further weakening Yuan authority. One of the most effective rebel leaders was Zhu Yuanzhang, a former peasant monk who rose through the ranks of the Red Turbans. Skilled in both leadership and strategy, he gradually consolidated power, defeating rival factions and presenting himself as a unifier rather than merely another warlord. By the 1360s, Zhu controlled much of central China and posed a direct challenge to the Yuan. The Yuan dynasty attempted to rally, but by this time, its authority had crumbled. Mongol rulers retreated northward, abandoning large parts of the south to the rebels. In 1368, Zhu Yuanzhang declared the founding of the Ming dynasty and marched on Dadu. The Yuan court fled into Mongolia, and the city fell without prolonged resistance. After nearly a century of Mongol rule, China returned to native hands. The fall of the Yuan dynasty marked the end of Mongol dominance in China, but not the end of their influence. The structures they had created, the capital at Dadu, the use of paper money, the networks of trade, continued to shape Chinese history. The Yuan era remained a controversial chapter, remembered for its brutality and discrimination, but also for its role in connecting China more directly to the wider world. For the Mongols themselves, the retreat into the steppe marked a return to their roots. No longer emperors of China, they rejoined the nomadic world, still powerful but diminished. The dream of Genghis Khan, to unite steppe and Sogn under one rule, had reached its greatest fulfillment under Kublai, only to collapse under the weight of its contradictions. The decline of the Yuan was part of a broader pattern. Across Eurasia, the Khanates were weakening. The Golden Horde faced rising powers in Russia. The Ilkhans in Persia struggled with succession crises and local resistance, and the Chagatai Khanate fragmented into rival states. The Pax Mongolica was ending, replaced by regional struggles and the slow re-emergence of local powers. While the Yuan dynasty in China was unraveling in the 14th century, the Mongol realm in Persia faced its own decline. The Ilkhanate, founded by Hulagu after his march into the Middle East, had once been among the most formidable of the Mongol domains. From its capital at Tabriz, it controlled Iran, Iraq, and parts of Anatolia. Stretching into the Caucasus, The Ilkhans presided over a wealthy land where trade routes converged, bringing goods from India and China westward and from the Mediterranean eastward. Yet, like the Yuan, the Ilkhanate could not escape the strains of ruling diverse populations or the challenges of succession. The early Ilkhans had established dominance with overwhelming military power. Hulagu's destruction of Baghdad in 1258 had ended the Abbasid Caliphate, shocking the Islamic world and demonstrating Mongol ferocity. Yet the conquest also left the Ilkhans ruling over a population that was overwhelmingly Muslim, while the Mongols themselves followed a mix of shamanism, Buddhism, and Christianity. The cultural and religious gap created tension. Over time, the Ilkhans converted to Islam, beginning with Ghazan in 1295. His conversion eased some hostility and allowed the dynasty to integrate more closely with Persian society. But it also tied the Ilkhans more directly to the religious and political rivalries of the region. Under Ghazan and his successor Olcay II, the Ilkhanate reached its high point. Reforms stabilized taxation, trade flourished, and scholarship was encouraged. Persian culture thrived under Mongol patronage, blending steppe traditions with the rich intellectual heritage of the Islamic world. But after Olcay II's death in 1316, the dynasty entered a period of instability. Successions were contested, weak rulers followed one another, and powerful nobles began to dominate the court. The central authority that had once made the Ilkhans formidable began to fracture. External pressures added to the decline. To the west, the Mamluks of Egypt remained a constant enemy. Their victory over the Mongols at Ain Jalut in 1260 had established them as defenders of the Islamic heartlands, and they continued to resist Ilkhanate expansion into Syria. To the north, the Golden Horde clashed with the Ilkhans over control of the Caucasus. These conflicts drained resources and prevented the Ilkhans from consolidating their realm. The economy also suffered. Heavy taxation burdened peasants and merchants, while rival factions diverted revenue to fund their own struggles. Trade routes remained active, but disorder reduced the confidence of merchants who had once thrived under Mongol protection. Inflation and mismanagement weakened the financial base of the state, leaving it vulnerable to crises. By the mid-14th century, the Ilkhanate was disintegrating. The death of Abu Sa'id in 1335, without an heir, triggered a collapse of authority. Local governors and warlords asserted independence, carving the once mighty realm into competing states. Some claimed descent from Genghis Khan to justify their rule, but the unity of the Ilkhanate was gone. The dream of a Mongol dynasty ruling Persia had ended less than a century after it began. In its place, a patchwork of successor states emerged. In western Persia, local dynasties such as the Jalayirids took power, while in the east, the Chobanids and other groups established control. These states lacked the stability and reach of the Ilkhanates, and Persia entered a period of fragmentation. Yet the legacy of Mongol rule lingered. Persian administration, art, and architecture had absorbed Mongol influences, creating a synthesis that endured long after the dynasty itself had vanished. The fall of the Ilkhanate also shifted the balance of power in the Islamic world. With the Mongols gone, the Mamluks of Egypt rose as the dominant force in the Middle East. Their prestige as defenders against the Mongols enhanced their authority, and they played a central role in the politics of the region for generations. The absence of a strong Persian dynasty left space for new powers to rise, including, eventually, Timur and his successors, who would claim descent from the Mongols to legitimize their own conquests. The decline of the Ilkhanate mirrored the broader pattern of Mongol fragmentation. Military power had created vast empires, but maintaining them required more than conquest. Succession disputes, cultural divisions, and economic strains undermined the foundations of Mongol rule. In Persia, as in China, the empire of Genghis Khan gave way to local dynasties shaped by both Mongol and native traditions. What remained was the memory of devastation and transformation. The Ilkhans had ended the Abbasid Caliphate, reshaped the politics of the Middle East, and left lasting marks on Persian culture. Their fall, like the fall of the Yuan, marked the end of one chapter in Mongol history and the beginning of another as new powers rose from the ruins of empire. While the Yuan dynasty collapsed in China and the Ilkhanate crumbled in Persia, the Golden Horde remained a powerful force on the steppes of Eastern Europe. Founded by Batu Khan, son of Yochi and grandson of Genghis Khan, the horde dominated the lands, stretching from the Volga River to the Carpathians. From their capital at Sarai, they ruled over a vast expanse of steppe and forest, controlling trade routes that linked Europe to Asia and demanding tribute from the princes of Rus. The Mongol conquest of Rus in the early 13th century had been brutal. Cities like Ryazan, Vladimir, and Kiev were destroyed, their populations slaughtered or enslaved. Survivors were forced into submission, and the princes of Rus became vassals, required to deliver tribute to the Khans of the Golden Horde. The Mongols did not attempt to rule Rus directly. Instead, they exercised control through local rulers who were allowed to govern their territories so long as they paid regularly and did not resist. This system of indirect rule left a deep imprint on the development of Eastern Europe. For more than 2 centuries, the princes of Rus were shaped by the demands of Mongol overlords. Tribute collection, military service, and submission became routine, while defiance was punished with swift and devastating raids. The Mongols also influenced local politics, granting authority to some princes over others, and thus shaping the rise and fall of regional powers. Among the many principalities, one gradually emerged as the most important, Moscow. Initially a minor settlement, it gained prominence through shrewd leadership and close cooperation with the Mongols. The princes of Moscow collected tribute efficiently, ensured loyalty, and used their position to expand their influence over neighboring territories. By presenting themselves as reliable vassals, they secured Mongol favor, which in turn gave them leverage over rivals. The Golden Horde benefited from this arrangement. Tribute flowed steadily, and the Khans relied on Moscow as a dependable partner in maintaining control. Yet this partnership also planted the seeds of independence. Over time, Moscow grew in wealth and power, eventually becoming strong enough to challenge Mongol dominance. The very system that had ensured control over Rus created the conditions for the rise of a new power that would one day overthrow it. Culturally, the Golden Horde was a blend of steppe traditions and Islamic influence. By the 14th century, many of its rulers had converted to Islam, integrating themselves into the broader Islamic world. The Sarai became a thriving city, filled with merchants from across Eurasia. Trade along the Volga connected the horde to the Black Sea, Central Asia, and China. Caravans and river traffic carried grain, furs, textiles, and silver, enriching both the Khans and the cities under their rule. Despite its wealth and influence, the Golden Horde faced challenges. Succession disputes were common, as rival claimants from the vast Jochigid lineage struggled for supremacy. Civil wars weakened central authority, and local nobles gained increasing independence. The Black Death, sweeping through Eurasia in the mid-14th century, devastated populations and disrupted trade. The unity of the horde, like that of other Mongol realms, eroded over time. In the 15th century, the balance of power shifted decisively. The princes of Moscow, having grown stronger under Mongol oversight, began to resist. Ivan III, known as Ivan the Great, stopped paying tribute and asserted independence. At the Battle of Kulikovo in 1380, Russian forces, led by Dmitry Donskoy, defeated a Mongol army, symbolizing the beginning of the end of Mongol dominance in the region. Though the horde remained a presence for decades, its power steadily declined, while Moscow rose as the nucleus of a new Russian state. The story of the Golden Horde was one of both dominance and transformation. For centuries, it held sway over the lands of Rus, shaping their political structures, economies, and identities. The Mongol system of tribute and vassalage influenced how Russian rulers exercised authority long after Mongol power had faded. At the same time, the horde connected Eastern Europe to the wider world, integrating it into the trade networks of Eurasia. The eventual fall of the Golden Horde did not erase its impact. It left behind a legacy of centralized authority, military organization, and cultural exchange that helped shape the rise of Muscovy and ultimately the Russian Empire. The Khans of Sarai were remembered both as overlords who demanded tribute and as gatekeepers who had tied the forests of the north to the steppe and beyond. As the Golden Horde declined, the age of Mongol dominance drew closer to its end. The once unified empire of Genghis Khan had given rise to great khanates, each powerful in its own right, but each subject to the same forces of division, succession, and resistance. By the 15th century, new powers were rising on the ruins of Mongol rule, carrying forward both the lessons and the legacies of the steppe. In the heart of Central Asia, stretching across the valleys, deserts, and mountains, between the Yuan in the east and the Ilkhanate in the west, lay the Chagatai Khanate. Founded by the descendants of Chagatai, the second son of Genghis Khan, this Khanate occupied a strategic position on the Silk Road. Its lands included modern-day Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and parts of western China. For centuries, it served as both a crossroads and a buffer, shaped by the legacies of steppe traditions and the demands of governing settled populations. The Chagatai Khanate differed from its siblings in character. While the Yuan in China leaned heavily on bureaucracy and the Ilkhans in Persia embraced local culture and Islam, the Chagatai realm remained closer to nomadic traditions for much of its history. Its rulers maintained steppe customs, relying on tribal structures and cavalry power. Yet they also presided over wealthy cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, centers of trade and scholarship that drew merchants from across Eurasia. Balancing nomadic and sedentary life was a constant challenge, one that shaped the Khanate's fate. Religion played a central role in this balance. Early rulers of the Chagatai Khanate often resisted Islam, preferring to hold to older Mongol and shamanistic practices. This created tension with the Muslim populations of Central Asia, who were deeply rooted in Islamic traditions. Over time, however, conversion spread, and by the 14th century, many rulers and elites embraced Islam. This shift transformed the Khanate, aligning it more closely with its neighbors and integrating it into the wider Islamic world. Despite its wealth and position, the Chagatai Khanate was plagued by instability. Succession disputes were frequent, with rival claimants vying for control. The vast expanse of territory and the diversity of its population made unity fragile. Tribal leaders often acted independently, undermining central authority. Civil wars fractured the state, and by the mid-14th century, the Khanate was deeply divided between its eastern and western halves. It was in this environment of fragmentation that a new figure rose. Timur, later known in the West as Tamerlane, born in 1336 near Samarkand. Timur was not a direct descendant of Genghis Khan, but claimed legitimacy through marriage alliances and by presenting himself as the restorer of Mongol order. From his youth, he displayed extraordinary ambition and military skill. Through a combination of diplomacy, ruthlessness, and battlefield success, he gathered a following and began to carve out power for himself in the fractured Chagatai realm. Timur built his authority carefully. He proclaimed loyalty to the legacy of Genghis Khan, even installing puppet khans from the Chagatai line to give his rule a veneer of legitimacy. But in practice, he was the true master. His armies combined Mongol cavalry tactics with innovations suited to the diverse regions he sought to conquer. Like Genghis before him, Timur demanded loyalty and punished betrayal harshly, while rewarding those who proved capable in war. From his base in Samarkand, Timur launched campaigns that echoed the great conquests of the past. He subdued rival tribes in Central Asia, bringing order to lands long fractured by civil strife. He then turned outward, striking at Persia, India, and the Middle East. His armies sacked Delhi in 1398, captured Damascus in 1401, and destroyed Baghdad in 1402. Each victory spread his fame and terror across Eurasia. Timur presented himself as the heir to the Mongol legacy. But his empire was in many ways distinct. Where Genghis Khan had built structures to endure, Timur often pursued conquest for its own sake, leaving devastation in his wake. Cities that resisted him were annihilated, their populations slaughtered or enslaved. At the same time, he patronized scholars, architects, and artists, turning Samarkand into a magnificent capital adorned with mosques, gardens, and palaces. This dual legacy of destruction and cultural flowering defined his reign. The rise of Timur marked both a continuation and a transformation of Mongol history. He drew inspiration from the conquests of Genghis Khan, invoking his name and adopting his tactics. Yet his empire was more personal, built on charisma and military genius rather than on stable institutions. After his death in 1405, his empire fragmented quickly, lacking the structures that had allowed the Mongols to endure for generations. The Chagatai Khanate itself never fully recovered its unity. While Timur overshadowed it for a time, the region remained contested, with shifting rulers and rival dynasties. Yet Central Asia continued to serve as a vital crossroads, its cities thriving as centers of trade, culture, and scholarship. The Mongol and Timurid legacies blended, leaving an imprint that shaped the region's identity for centuries. The story of the Chagatai Khanate and the rise of Timur highlights the enduring influence of Genghis Khan's empire. Even as the unified Mongol state fragmented, the memory of its founder remained powerful. Leaders who came after, whether true descendants or ambitious outsiders, invoked his name to claim legitimacy. The idea of Mongol authority, born on the steppe in the 12th century, continued to shape the politics of Eurasia long after the original empire had dissolved. By the 15th century, the unified empire forged by Genghis Khan no longer existed. In its place stood separate khanates, some fading, some transformed, and others replaced by new powers like the Timurids. Yet the influence of the Mongols did not vanish with political fragmentation. Their impact on Eurasia was profound and lasting, shaping trade, culture, warfare, and political structures for centuries. One of the clearest legacies lay in the realm of trade. The Pax Mongolica had created networks of exchange that outlived the empire itself. Merchants continued to travel routes established under Mongol protection, moving silk, spices, furs, and precious metals across the continent. Even after the khanates weakened, the expectation of long-distance trade endured. Italian city-states, such as Venice and Genoa, profited enormously, linking the Mediterranean to the Black Sea and onward to Asia. The flow of goods, helped sustain prosperity in Europe, and connected distant regions in ways that could not be undone. With trade came cultural exchange. Chinese technologies such as printing, gunpowder, and the compass spread westward, influencing military and navigational developments in Europe. Islamic mathematics, medicine, and astronomy traveled eastward, enriching Chinese and Central Asian scholarship. Art, literature, and architecture blended styles from different regions, producing unique syntheses. Samarkand, under Timur, for example, became a showcase of Persian artistry, Mongol grandeur, and Central Asian craftsmanship. The Mongols themselves may have been conquerors first, but they also served as conduits for ideas. Religion, too, bore the imprint of Mongol rule. The Khans tolerated multiple faiths, allowing Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, and traditional practices to coexist. This environment encouraged dialogue and movement. Buddhist monks from Tibet, Muslim scholars from Persia, and Christian missionaries from Europe traveled freely, spreading doctrines and exchanging ideas. The eventual conversion of many Mongol rulers to Islam integrated vast regions more deeply into the Islamic world, while the Yuan dynasty's support for Buddhism left lasting marks on East Asia. Politically, the Mongol model of governance influenced successor states. Their use of census-taking, relay stations, and systematic taxation inspired later rulers in Russia, China, and Central Asia. The princes of Moscow, who had learned statecraft under Mongol oversight, applied similar methods to consolidate power, laying the groundwork for the rise of the Russian Empire. In China, the Ming dynasty adopted and adapted many administrative practices pioneered by the Yuan. Even in places where Mongol rule was remembered with resentment, their systems left an enduring stamp. Military strategy across Eurasia was also transformed. The Mongols had demonstrated the effectiveness of mobility, discipline, and coordination over sheer numbers. Their use of feigned retreats, encirclements, and combined arms, cavalry, siege engines, and engineers changed the way wars were fought. European knights, who had faced Mongol armies at Legnica and Mohi, recognized that traditional heavy cavalry was vulnerable to such tactics. Over time, military thinkers across the continent incorporated lessons from Mongol methods, shaping the evolution of warfare. The Mongol conquests also had unintended consequences. By linking regions more closely than ever before, they accelerated the spread of disease. The bubonic plague, carried along trade and military routes, spread from Central Asia into Europe and the Middle East in the mid-14th century. The Black Death killed millions, reshaping societies and economies. While the plague cannot be blamed on the Mongols alone, their networks made it spread faster and more devastating than it might otherwise have been. Cultural memory of the Mongols varied widely. In China, they were remembered as foreign rulers whose dynasty was overthrown, but also as a dynasty that had integrated Chinese institutions and left architectural and administrative legacies. In the Islamic world, the destruction of Baghdad remained a wound, but the Ilkhan's later embrace of Islam softened the legacy. In Russia, the memory of Mongol domination shaped national identity, casting the horde as oppressors but also as teachers in statecraft. In Europe, the Mongols were both feared as invaders and admired for their wealth and sophistication, a dual image that persisted in chronicles and travel accounts. The idea of Mongol descent retained power long after the empire itself fractured. Timur claimed legitimacy through association with Genghis Khan's line, even though he was not a direct descendant. Later rulers in Central Asia and India, including the founders of the Mughal Empire, invoked Mongol ancestry to bolster their authority. The prestige of the name endured, symbolizing both conquest and order. Even the simple fact of scale left a legacy. No empire before had connected so many lands under one framework. The Mongols demonstrated that it was possible to link the Pacific to the Mediterranean, to bring China and Europe into direct contact, and to enforce rules across deserts, steppes, and mountains. Later empires learned from both their successes and their failures, studying how the Mongols had achieved so much so quickly, and why their unity could not endure. By the 15th century, the Khanates that remained were shadows of their former selves. Yet the world they had shaped was permanently altered. Trade routes, cultural exchanges, military practices, and political institutions bore the mark of the Mongols. Even as their direct power faded, their influence lingered in the structures of Eurasian history. The empire of Genghis Khan had been temporary, but its consequences were enduring. As the direct rule of the Mongols faded in the 15th century, their memory continued to influence the course of history. The image of Genghis Khan and his descendants became part of the foundation of new states, new dynasties, and even new global connections. Though the empire itself had fractured, the prestige of Mongol heritage retained power across Eurasia. In the Islamic world, the legacy of the Ilkhans and Timur shaped the rise of later dynasties. Timur's empire collapsed quickly after his death, but his descendants continued to rule parts of Central Asia and Persia. In India, one of those descendants, Babur, founded the Mughal Empire in the 16th century. Though his name echoed Mongol, Babur's state was thoroughly rooted in the Indian subcontinent, blending Persian, Central Asian, and Indian traditions. Yet his claim of descent from both Timur and Genghis Khan gave his dynasty legitimacy, linking it to the greatest conquerors of the past. The Mughals went on to build one of the richest and most enduring empires in South Asia, carrying the Mongol legacy into a new age. In the Middle East, the fall of the Ilkhanate created space for new powers. Among them were the Ottomans, who rose from a small principality in Anatolia to become a world empire. Though not descended from the Mongols, the Ottomans inherited a region shaped by Mongol invasions and the collapse of earlier powers. Their military organization, use of cavalry, and flexible approach to religion and administration bore indirect marks of Mongol precedent. The memory of Mongol devastation also served as a contrast, with the Ottomans presenting themselves as restorers of order after centuries of upheaval. In Russia, the centuries of Mongol rule left deep imprints on political culture. The princes of Moscow had learned to centralize authority, collect taxes, and maintain discipline from their time as vassals of the Golden Horde. When Moscow threw off Mongol rule, it carried forward many of these practices, using them to expand and consolidate what became the Russian state. The memory of the Mongols as oppressors was strong, but the tools they left behind became part of the foundation for Russia's rise as a Eurasian power. Europe's relationship with Mongol memory was more complex. In the 13th century, the Mongols had terrified European kingdoms, defeating armies in Poland and Hungary. Yet as time passed, their role as destroyers faded, and their role as connectors came into focus. European merchants and travelers had reached Asia under Mongol protection, and the goods they brought back sparked new demand. Stories of Kublai Khan's wealth and the wonders of China inspired explorers like Christopher Columbus, who read Marco Polo's accounts and dreamed of reaching Asia directly. In this way, the Mongol Empire indirectly encouraged the voyages of discovery that opened the Atlantic world. Culturally, the Mongols were remembered in different ways, depending on the region. In China, the Yuan dynasty was often portrayed as a foreign imposition, its fall celebrated as the restoration of native rule under the Ming. Yet the Yuan period also introduced new influences, from Persian astronomy to Central Asian art, which remained part of Chinese culture. In the Islamic world, the memory of the destruction of Baghdad endured as a symbol of catastrophe, yet the later Islamization of the Ilkhans softened their image in some traditions. In Mongolia itself, Genghis Khan remained a heroic figure, revered as the unifier of the steppe and a symbol of national identity. The Mongol reputation also became part of global imagination. To some, they were symbols of barbarism and cruelty, remembered for massacres and devastation. To others, they were models of discipline, organization, and ambition, remembered for creating the largest land empire in history. This dual image, destroyers and builders, ruthless conquerors, and enablers of trade, ensured that their legacy remained a subject of fascination and debate. In many places, rulers and states continued to claim Mongol ancestry to strengthen their legitimacy. Even centuries after the fall of the Khanates, the name of Genghis Khan carried weight. Dynasties from Central Asia to India invoked him to connect themselves to the memory of conquest and authority. The prestige of Mongol bloodlines endured long after the empire itself had vanished. The Mongols also left behind a geographic legacy. They had shifted the centers of power, drawing attention to regions like Central Asia, which became vital crossroads of trade and culture. Cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Tabriz flourished as hubs of learning and exchange, their prominence built on the foundations laid during Mongol rule. The idea of Eurasia as a connected space, rather than a set of isolated civilizations, was one of the most enduring consequences of their empire. As centuries passed, the memory of the Mongols was reshaped by each new generation. In some regions, they were remembered as villains, in others as heroes. In modern Mongolia, Genghis Khan became a national icon, his image restored after centuries of neglect. In global history, he is recognized as both a destroyer and a creator, a man whose ambition changed the course of the world. The transformation of Mongol memory demonstrates the scale of their impact. Empires come and go, but few leave legacies so contested and so powerful. Even after the Khanates faded, their influence was visible in the rise of successor states, the opening of trade, and the imaginations of explorers. The Mongols had reshaped Eurasia, and the echoes of their empire continued to be felt long after their direct power was gone. The Mongol Empire is often remembered for its sweeping conquests, the speed of its cavalry, and the destruction it left in its path. Yet its longer legacy lay not only in battles won or cities destroyed, but in the systems it created. The Mongols developed ways of governing, communicating, and waging war that shaped later empires and influenced the course of world history. These innovations endured even after their political power had faded, proving more lasting than the empire itself. One of the most important contributions was the relay system, known as the yam. Across the empire, stations were built at intervals of roughly 20 to 30 miles. Each was stocked with fresh horses, supplies, and guards. Couriers carrying messages or goods could change horses quickly and continue at speed, covering distances unimaginable in earlier centuries. This system allowed orders from the Great Khan to reach distant generals in weeks rather than months. Merchants and envoys benefited as well, making long-distance trade and diplomacy more reliable. Later states, including the Russian principalities under Moscow and the early modern empires of Europe, adopted similar systems to manage communication across large territories. Census-taking was another innovation that reshaped governance. The Mongols insisted on knowing the number of households, livestock, and resources in every conquered region. This information allowed them to distribute taxation fairly by their standards and to ensure armies were supplied. It also provided a clear picture of populations, something earlier nomadic conquerors had rarely attempted. Successor states in China, Persia, and Russia continued this practice, using censuses to structure taxation and conscription. The idea of a state having detailed knowledge of its people became central to later empires. In law, the Mongols developed a code known as the Yasa. Though parts of it remain mysterious, its principles were clear: loyalty to the Khan, obedience to orders, and strict punishment for betrayal or theft. The Yasa emphasized merit over birth in military appointments, reflecting Genghis Khan's policy of rewarding skill and loyalty rather than noble lineage. This meritocratic principle influenced the rise of centralized states, where loyalty to the ruler mattered more than aristocratic privilege. Religious tolerance was another hallmark of Mongol rule. While they could be ruthless toward rebels, the Mongols often allowed conquered peoples to practice their own faiths. Temples, mosques, and churches stood side by side in many Mongol cities. The Khans themselves received blessings from Buddhist monks, Muslim clerics, and Christian priests alike. This tolerance was pragmatic. It reduced resistance and made governance easier, but it also set an example of multi-faith coexistence. Later empires, such as the Mughals in India and the Ottomans in the Middle East, built on this principle to manage their own diverse populations. In warfare, the Mongols revolutionized strategy. Their armies combined mobility with discipline, something few opponents could match. The use of feigned retreats, in which Mongol units pretended to flee before turning to encircle pursuers, baffled enemies accustomed to straightforward combat. Coordinated attacks by units organized into tens, hundreds, and thousands allowed precise maneuvers on the battlefield. Siege warfare was transformed as well. By incorporating engineers from China and the Islamic world, the Mongols used catapults, trebuchets, and gunpowder weapons with devastating effect. These techniques spread as their armies advanced, influencing warfare in Europe and the Middle East. The Mongols also demonstrated the importance of psychological warfare. Before attacking, they often sent envoys demanding surrender, offering leniency to those who submitted and total destruction to those who resisted. Tales of massacres traveled faster than the armies themselves, encouraging cities to capitulate rather than face annihilation. This combination of terror and mercy became a strategic tool, reducing resistance and conserving resources. Later conquerors studied and imitated this approach, recognizing that fear could be as powerful as the sword. Administrative practices spread widely through Mongol influence. In Persia, the Ilkhans adopted Chinese methods of taxation and record-keeping, blending them with Islamic traditions. In Russia, Mongol systems of tribute collection and centralized authority shaped the rise of Muscovy. In China, the Yuan dynasty institutionalized many Mongol reforms, from paper currency to the reorganization of provincial administration. Each region adapted these practices to its own traditions, but the Mongol imprint was unmistakable. Even in decline, the Khanates preserved and transmitted these innovations. The Golden Horde kept the tribute system alive in Eastern Europe, while the Ilkhans promoted scholarship that blended Chinese, Persian, and Greek influences. The Chagatai realm served as a conduit for cultural and economic exchange, while the Yuan dynasty left a permanent mark on Chinese governance and infrastructure. Through these channels, Mongol systems outlived their empire. The Mongols also reshaped the very idea of empire. Before Genghis Khan, few imagined that one ruler could govern lands from the Pacific to the Mediterranean. By proving it possible, however briefly, the Mongols set a precedent. Later rulers, from Timur to the Mughals to European monarchs, drew inspiration from the vision of a world empire. Even when they criticized Mongol brutality, they admired the scale of their ambition and the efficiency of their systems. In sum, the Mongols were not merely conquerors who left ruins in their wake. They were innovators who built frameworks of communication, governance, and warfare that others adopted and adapted. The empire itself dissolved, but the systems it created shaped the rise of later powers and the connections of a more global world. In the span of a single lifetime, Genghis Khan transformed the world. Born into obscurity on the harsh grasslands of Mongolia, he rose from abandonment and hardship to command the loyalty of thousands. With discipline, vision, and ruthless determination, he united the tribes of the steppe and launched a wave of conquest that reshaped Eurasia. By the time of his death in 1227, he had forged the largest land empire in history, one that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the shores of the Caspian Sea. The story of that empire did not end with him. His descendants carried forward his conquests, toppling dynasties, destroying caliphates, and pushing into Europe. Under Ogedei, the Mongols swept into Russia and Hungary. Under Mongke and Kublai, they stormed Baghdad, crushed the Song dynasty, and ruled China as emperors of the Yuan. Across Eurasia, the name of Genghis Khan became synonymous with power, fear, and inevitability. But conquest was only part of the legacy. The Mongols built systems that outlasted their empire. They organized their people into disciplined units, established laws that bound warriors and nobles alike, and created a network of relay stations that tied together vast distances. They tolerated multiple religions, welcomed merchants, and demanded accountability from governors. For the first time, Eurasia functioned as a connected whole, with ideas, goods, and people flowing across continents under Mongol protection. This Pax Mongolica was both a blessing and a curse. It allowed trade and cultural exchange on an unprecedented scale, linking China more closely to Europe than ever before. But it also spread disease, carrying the plague that devastated populations from Central Asia to the Mediterranean. The Mongols did not create the world's interconnectedness, but they accelerated it, making the 13th and 14th centuries a turning point in global history. The empire fractured within a century of Genghis Khan's death. The Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhans in Persia, the Chagatai in Central Asia, and the Yuandid in China, each pursued their own paths. Rivalries, succession disputes, and local resistance eroded unity. By the 15th century, the Mongols no longer dominated Eurasia. New powers rose: Ottomans in the Middle East, Ming in China, and Moscow in Russia, reshaping the lands the Mongols had once ruled. Yet the memory of the Mongols endured. Timur claimed legitimacy by invoking Genghis Khan's legacy, even as his empire crumbled after his death. The Mughals of India traced their ancestry to both Timur and Genghis, building one of the wealthiest dynasties in history. In Russia, lessons learned under Mongol overlordship shaped the rise of the Tsars. In Europe, stories of Mongol wealth and power inspired explorers like Columbus to seek new routes to Asia. In Mongolia itself, Genghis Khan remained a figure of awe and reverence. Though centuries passed, his name never disappeared from the steppe. He was remembered not only as a conqueror, but as the unifier of his people, the lawgiver who bound tribes into a nation. In modern times, he has become a national symbol, a reminder of Mongolia's place in world history. The legacy of Genghis Khan is a paradox. He was both a destroyer and a creator. His armies slaughtered cities and toppled kingdoms, leaving devastation in their wake. Yet he also built systems that promoted trade, connected cultures, and fostered exchange. He ruled with ruthlessness, but also with pragmatism, rewarding loyalty and ability regardless of birth. His vision of unity, born on the steppe, reshaped the political and cultural map of Eurasia. Today, historians continue to debate his legacy. Was he the most destructive conqueror in history, or the architect of a new global order? The answer is that he was both. His empire did not last in its original form, but its impact was permanent. The Mongols proved that the world could be connected, that distant civilizations could be bound together by roads, trade, and law. They showed that ideas and technologies could move as swiftly as armies, changing societies far from their point of origin. The man who began life as an outcast on the steppe became one of the most influential figures in human history. His story is not only about conquest, but about the ways power can shape societies, connect worlds, and leave legacies far beyond the lives of rulers. From the ruins of cities to the flourishing of trade, from the terror of his armies to the prestige of his name, Genghis Khan's shadow stretched across centuries. In closing, the rise and fall of the Mongol Empire remind us of the impermanence of power and the endurance of influence. Empires fade, borders shift, and rulers die, but ideas, systems, and memories endure. Genghis Khan's empire was built on horseback and held together by discipline and vision. Though it fractured, its echoes shaped the world that followed. His life, marked by hardship, conquest, and creation, stands as one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of humanity.